the nature of the problem and what they feel might be done about it. So our speakers today, first of all, we have Dustin Gardner joining us from the Ventura County Fire Department. He's the chief of this department and a 27-year veteran of wildland firefighting in California. He's responded to some of the most devastating fires in California, most recently the 2017 Thomas Fire that burned more than 280,000 acres and destroyed more than 1,100 structures, causing $2.2 billion in damages. Dustin sits on the Fire Scope Board of Directors and is an operational area coordinator for the California Office of Emergency Services. We also have Sean Triplett, the Tools and Technology Team lead for the U.S. Forest Service Fire and Aviation Program. In this role, he manages a diverse portfolio of programs that focus on evaluating technologies and their associated data for their use in enhancing situational awareness, allowing firefighters to know the location of where the fire is, where it could go, and how they can safely work in that environment. Deborah Sivas from Stanford University, the Luke W. Cole Professor of Environmental Law at Stanford Law School. She also directs the Stanford Environmental Law Clinic and the Environmental and Natural Resource Law and Policy Program. She's written about practice under numerous federal and state environmental statutes. She also co-teaches interdisciplinary graduate courses and policy labs in a variety of areas, including coastal law and science, federal public lands, trends in environmental regulation, climate issues, and wildland fires. And finally, Rod Lynn. He's a senior scientist in the Earth and Environmental Sciences Division at Los Alamos National Laboratory. For over 2 decades, he has been a leader in the field of coupled fire atmosphere modeling. He led the development of the coupled fire atmosphere model FireTech, which combines computational fluid dynamics and process-based heat transfer and fire modeling. So each of these individuals will provide us with some comments, and then we'll open it up to the PCAST membership for questions and discussion. So Dustin, we'll turn it over to you first, I think.
All righty, I'll test if you can hear me. You can. Okay, then I will say good morning or good afternoon, depending on where we're all at, to all of you and all the members of the public and our fellow speakers that are here today. Thank you. I really do appreciate this invite and this opportunity to be part of this discussion with the leaders in science and technology that I truly do believe can help us in our firefighting industry and help us provide a safer response and mitigation to these emergencies. As you've been discussing, as you mentioned this morning, climate change and global warming is leading to far more devastating weather patterns. We're seeing hotter, drier, windier conditions, stronger storms, more frequent tornadoes, and as you said, with 85% of the Southwest in extreme drought, we're seeing far more devastating fires. Fires are starting more often, they're growing faster, and they're becoming more destructive than any time in history that we've been watching them. Over the last decade alone, 50,000 structures have been destroyed in the West. Hundreds of lives have been lost, and hundreds of billions of dollars in economic impact has occurred. In California, since we've been recording fire history since 1932, 8 of the largest fires have happened in just the last 4 years, to show how fast and how frequent these fires are beginning to burn and impact us. In 2018, the Thomas Fire, the one Maria mentioned earlier, I was the incident commander of, and at the time, that was the largest fire in California history. Since 2018, it's already been passed 6 times. So the fires in California and in the West are certainly growing and devastating far more areas. We've been watching these fires grow. We're watching the impacts they're having on our waterways, our drinking water, our air quality, people's homes, where they can live, the economy, and of course, spreading even more greenhouse gases. There are a number of ways and independent factors that several policy groups in several different areas are looking, from prevention to changes in building codes to learning to live with fire as society and to do more prescription or RX burning. Many of these factors are already getting a lot of attention and being discussed, and we really are moving in a good direction towards dealing with them. But three of the things that I thought this body could hear, or this body as the leaders in science and technology could help us with, is the detection of fires, the tracking of resources, and the monitoring of fires. So that's all I'm going to cover this afternoon, is detection, tracking, and monitoring. As far as detection goes, we know most of the fires that occur in the West, the destructive fires at least, occur in a very narrow profile. It's when the weather's hot, it's when the weather's dry, and it's when the weather's windy. We see most of our fire devastation, death, and destruction in the first 12 hours of a firefight. So that leads to the importance of detection. With prolonged droughts and with increased wind events, we're seeing these fires get larger faster. So the faster we can see a fire, detect a fire, and notify responders, not just fire responders, but police responders, emergency managers, policymakers, elected officials, everybody involved in the wildfire or the destruction of wildfires, the faster we can notify them and let them know there is a disaster or a fire starting, the faster we can jump on and respond to it. In Southern California, that's not as big of a deal because, of course, we have more than 10 million people and every one of them has a cell phone and they can see and detect fires early and notify us early. But throughout the forest with lightning detection sensors, smoke detection sensors, the ability to see it from far in the atmosphere and detect remote fires and make warnings sooner, that could significantly increase our chances or help us in fighting these. The second is tracking of resources, and tracking of resources is really somewhere I think we can improve and with help get much better. We're using a resource ordering and tracking system that was developed in the 40s, and it was developed primarily to move military equipment for World War II. It works. It's a decent product. It's been recently revamped, but in today's world, when we have the ability to order things, at our fingertips, every one of your cell phones sitting on your desk in front of you can order whatever you need and have it delivered to your house tomorrow. I don't understand why, as incident commanders, we can order resources and not have them be processed for 2 days. We can be clearing resources that we send outside of the system before they're ever processed. So the resource ordering system could certainly be improved. And another critical piece of tracking is resource tracking. We all saw following the Yarnell fire and the tragic loss of 19 Granite Mountain hotshots that attention was given towards resource tracking. It took a long time to find those firefighters. And in a day and age when we all have cell phones in our pockets, we all have GPS following us at all times, the fact that we can't track one another and we can't find one another on a fire immediately is unbearable at times. And when we work and live in a system where neighbors have to help neighbors, and the fact that I can't track my neighbor's firefighters and he can't track mine, that is definitely somewhere we could use some help. And monitoring fires comes in really in two parts. Like we said, the early detection, being able to see a fire and then monitor it. This is where modeling and really, I guess, forecasting fire growth could help. One is if we can monitor a fire in real time, and these are fires now that we're seeing move. We had a fire move 14 miles in one night. That's 14 miles running at more than 100,000 people that we had to move out of the way in one night, in winds that were so strong we couldn't put our helicopters in the air, which is what we normally use for our advanced intel or tracking fires. So if we had the ability to track fires in real time, to see where those perimeters are at in an actionable enough time that we could make decisions on the ground as far as where to move resources to, and more importantly, where to evacuate people from, that would be a significant help. Along with that is the ability to monitor and forecast. And as Maria mentioned, a couple of my fellow speakers on here are true subject matter experts on modeling fire. And if we could have that ability to monitor fires, to then forecast their growth, to then lay that on top of a data source we could share with other fireground commanders, with other emergency responders, with other emergency managers, and most importantly, the public, to make them aware there is a fire and aware of the path of that fire. It will help us move people. It will help us make smarter decisions, and it'll help us get people out of the way. We've seen in incidents, fire moving so fast, and people are so insulated in their homes with dual pane windows and solid core doors and everything we've done to create more environmentally sound homes. We've created safer, quieter homes where people don't know what's happening outside of their homes. We need to find ways to alert them via their cell phones, their televisions, their however they're monitoring or tracking with data. We need to find ways we can access them, notify them, and then show them where fires are at, show them how to get out of an area and where to respond to. I believe if we had a way where we could collect that data, we had a known or standard operating system to receive it, we had a way to, and this is where your experts come in, from collecting it to then sending it back down to us, to where we could all use one platform or one way of seeing it and sharing it. It would be a monumental help for us. Those are three simple ways. And again, I could spend hours talking about any simple one of them, but in the limited time we have, I just want to put that out there. You guys are the true experts. You know how to fix things, alter things, create things, deliver things that I have no idea they even exist. I know I have a problem. I know we have a problem in the West, and we need help tracking resources, monitoring fires, predicting spread, and notifying people. It'll help us stay safer. It'll help us keep our responders safer, and it'll help us keep our public safer. And with that, I thank you for your commitment to this. I thank you for your willingness to help. I know from listening to past PCAST meetings, you all have extraordinarily busy day jobs, and yet you're here to help society stay safer and help us deal with these global climate changes that are above and beyond any of us. So for that, I thank you. I thank you for your willingness to help. I look forward to the discussion today, and I will be here for any questions. Thank you, Maria.
Great. Dustin, thank you very much for your comments, for your leadership, your service. Sean, you're going to be up next.
All right. Can you hear me? Just an audio check?
Yes, we can.
All right. And can you see my screen?
We can see you.
You can see me. Wonderful. I'll turn my camera off and share my screen again.
Okay, this looks promising.
You got it?
Okay, we're all set.
All right. Well, thank you. And Dustin, great presentation. We appreciate all the great work you've been doing in Ventura County. Again, I'm Sean Triplett. I work for the Forest Service at the National Interagency Fire Center, and I thank you for this opportunity. Today, I'm going to talk to you about what Dustin kind of alluded to there with wildfire detection and monitoring. And the first question I'd ask the group is, what if we had that system in place today? How would we be doing our jobs differently? How would we be viewing and tracking fires differently? I use the word tracking there, but as Dustin mentioned earlier, in the fire space, we use tracking a little bit differently in the wildfire arena. We talk and refer to that as tracking our firefighters. Monitoring is kind of more the system or language we use when we're talking about monitoring fires as they move across the landscape. So why and what are we using for detection monitoring fires? So the first answer, why. So obviously we know if we can, as Dustin alluded to, if we can get a hold of these fires earlier, understand what they're doing, become more situation aware as that fire's moving across the landscape, we can reduce risk and we can reduce cost. It's not only risk to our firefighters, but to our public, and then the public lands and the resources that our firefighters are protecting. Why do we need these systems? Because as Dustin alluded to, our fires are becoming larger, they're more complex, and they're occurring across multiple geographic areas at one time. When we talk about the Western US, we can have fires. In many years, we've had fires burning in Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, the Southwest, and even on the East Coast and like the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia. That's a lot of real estate to cover, a lot of fires, a lot of areas to monitor, which causes our resources to get stretched thin. We also have an ever expanding population in the West. These millions of people that have moved to the West, some places they're building homes within that wildland urban interface area, and that's putting more values at risk as we continue to expand the population in the West. We're very well aware of the increased fuel loading on our landscape. Maria talked about the drought that we're experiencing here in the West. So as we've increased our fuels, we've also reduced our moisture and our climate becoming more drier, which is causing the landscape to just become more and more susceptible to large fires. And last but not least, we have moved into a fire year rather than a fire season. And again, this just stretches our resources further and further. Our resources are becoming tired, they're getting overworked, and it's a very extensive physical toll on our firefighters, our population. It has to deal with the smoke, and then just the other values at risk, like our watersheds. So being able to detect and monitor these fires helps bring all those different risks into view and allow us to make better decisions about those. So we talk about wildfire detection and monitoring within the wildfire community. We refer to this as incident awareness and assessment. This is a term that we've picked up from our National Guard Bureau friends who use this same type of methodology when they respond to earthquakes and floods and hurricanes. And when we look at wildfire monitoring detection, there's various technologies that we have out there. Space-based, so satellite, we have government-owned satellites, we have commercial satellites, we have our international partners. And those satellites are all flying in different orbits. We have constellations of satellites that we can use. We have some in GEO, which are looking from way far out in space at the US, and they're in other different polar type orbits. We have aircraft. We typically have used aircraft in a mapping fashion, which is a 12 to 24 hour cycle of just perimeter mapping. Recent innovations have brought about tactical mapping, which is bringing in real-time support of mapping of fires. So bringing the ability to support firefighters on the ground involved in operations. And then the unmanned systems are just growing by day in our use, and we're learning more and more on how to integrate them into our airspace and work with them to provide us awareness and detecting of fires. We've also have built out extensive camera systems across the country, where we've replaced existing lookouts with cameras that have multiple fields of view. We've added camera systems to communication towers, and we're adding new locations almost monthly. And these camera systems are 365, constantly staring across the landscape, monitoring and looking for new fire starts. We've deployed mobile camera systems where we can move them as the fire moves, and as the fire begins to impact areas or values at risk, we can place those mobile cameras in the path of those fires and near those fires, so people can view and monitor the fire without putting themselves at risk. And last but not least, resource or firefighter tracking, which Dustin talked about. So we have a couple different flavors of resource tracking. When we look at this, you have your simple satellite-based, GPS-based system, which is basically pinging the location of a firefighting or a firefighter resource. But we also have that real-time situational awareness, where we're able to take that detection and monitoring information and put it onto the mobile device of the firefighter. Allow the firefighter to see where they are in their adjoining resources. Where are they at in location to the fire and their escape routes? And where's the weather coming from that they're going to have to deal with as they're fighting the fire? All of these have really been focused on a capability gap that we've identified at the National Fire Center with our interagency partners is persistence. Being able to loiter over a fire or a large geographic area with detection and monitoring equipment to monitor fires as they grow and detect fires as we have dry lightning and other storms go through. But our biggest hurdle with all these different technologies is what we call our last mile connection. How do we get this data to the boots on the ground? We have an incredible amount of data that we're currently collecting and will be collecting as technologies evolve. But when you get from the ICP, the Incident Command Post, or from a built up or developed area to where the firefighters are operating, we break down. The communication infrastructure is just not there. In many places, we're using radio systems that have been around for 50 years. They're simple push-to-talk devices, but they're not able to handle the large amounts of bandwidth that's required in sharing this type of information. To make all these different types of information work, we really need to have an interoperable, integrated system. As Dustin mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different agencies out there that respond to fire. And as we put tracking devices on fires, which we did this past summer, one of the first things we learned is that there's hundreds of tracking devices out there, but none of them really talk to each other. So we have to build standards and integration capabilities to allow all this data to come together. And that includes bringing in the detection and monitoring data. All of these require data standards, they require integration or APIs to be built, and it requires all the agencies to work together to solve these problems. One of the screenshots that you see up there is a capability model that was built by our data management committee and the National Wildfire Coordination Group. So they begin tackling this effort, but as they work towards this, we're realizing that technology is continuing to grow and grow and grow. So it's always trying to keep up with new capabilities that come along, building those capability and standard models out to allow for that interoperability and integration. So really a quick way to tackle this is thinking about this from a programmatic approach from all levels of government. Operationally, myself as a Fed, as a Forest Service firefighter, I can go to the Thomas Fire and we can work integrated and interoperable. For the reason for this is because our operational community does not follow agency and jurisdictional boundaries or policies. Put on my yellow shirt, my green pants, and I can go to Ventura County, I can go to Florida, I can go to North Carolina or Alaska, and we're all working together operationally. However, when we look at the technology, the sciences that we're building, the budgets that we all work under, our data management practices, they all kind of tailor to an agency or a programmatic level. So there's a breakdown of that integration interoperable. So when we're working to build monitoring and detection capabilities, we have to look across the portfolio. We have had some efforts move forward with, again, as I mentioned, the National Wildfire Coordination Group, the Data Management Committee, and our Geospatial Subcommittee. A Geospatial Subcommittee recently built an interchange standard for wildfire perimeter sharing, which last year received over 3 billion hits from the public and from firefighters for moving and sharing information about current fire location. We really need to take a hard look at building cross-agency, cross-departmental solutions to bring together the data and the science of monitoring and detection so it can be used across the enterprise. Another portion of this is really looking at how we train and build up our firefighting staff. As these technologies rapidly develop and move forward, we need to be able to coordinate across our agencies, coordinate across our partnerships to build training programs that allow our firefighters, decision makers, and agency leads keep up and understand what this different data is telling them and how they can use it to be applicable for monitoring and tracking or detecting of fires. So all of this is occurring through partnerships. The wildfire community, we're not artificial intelligence experts. We have incredibly talented firefighters that work for us. We have incredibly talented researchers, but we know it takes an army of partnerships to solve this wildfire problem. So on the screen, I have a list of a variety of agencies that we're currently working with, from NASA to NOAA, Department of Energy, USGS, commercial, private, and academia partners, our National Guard partners through the Fire Guard program, and building and expanding out our ground-based systems. All of these different partnerships are working to develop and implement technologies to have a better understanding of the fire environment, but provide us better monitoring and technology to see where the wildfire is and where it's going. So where do we want to go as a wildfire community? So currently, I like to say we live in what's called a good idea factory. We have a lot of different silos or centers of excellence across the community. A lot of folks are looking at different requirements and approaching the wildfire program from a very, maybe a myopic view or a very small view. With a struggle that we deal with, especially when you look at putting something in place that has to cover multiple geographic areas and the nation as a whole, is how do you lift that up and move it to a programmatic support program that's funded and integrated across the country. So ideally, we would like to be into a national integrated system where all of our detection and monitoring capabilities were coming together into one standard program that allows for like a tipping and queuing. So currently the Colorado multi-mission aircraft is down in Texas supporting the Texas Forest Service with some of the fires that they've had down there. It's a full motion video based camera system flying to support the fires. And as you think about that, flying over a 100 to a 300,000 acre fire, that's a very small footprint that aircraft is able to map and support. What ideally we'd have that system integrated with other systems that we're monitoring, detecting, so they can tip and cue each other. So as one system was maybe discovering new fires or watching a fire get up and get legs and starting to move and make the runs like Dustin was talking about earlier, it would notify and alert not only the other systems, but the other firefighters and other public with those need to know. So those systems can start sharing information and have more of a situational awareness of what that fire is doing, where it's going, and what impacts it's going to have to the communities, values at risk, and to the firefighters. So detection and monitoring is just one piece of the puzzle. And when I talk about that program and I look at it from the national scale and what would the PCAST could help us with, we really, as we build out these programs, again, I'll go back to that last mile connectivity. We have to get the data to the boots on the ground. We have to have the communication infrastructure and that backbone to get the data as it's collected and processed to those that need it so they can have actionable intelligence and make those decisions. The system, it needs to be integrated into the system. We have a very mature, robust fire system. I don't want to say we're set in our ways, but we do have a very methodical process in how we detect and monitor fires. So how are we going to take and integrate these new pieces of information into that system? And again, scalable is highly important. Not all fires are large mega fires like we see on TV. A lot of fires, over 98% of them, are captured before they get before 2 operational periods. So it needs to be able to handle those small fires as well as our large landscape fires. And any of these systems, for them to be interoperable and integrated into the system, that we have to base them on standards and requirements. We need to be able to share and move data between systems. We need to be able to have common standard data practices and data standards so we can build better business intelligence tools and alerting tools. We need to work within our agencies and our programs to identify this as something of a need. We need to get leadership support behind it. We need to have funding and programmatic support to make this as something that can be shared across the community and not just individual efforts. And as I mentioned earlier, partnerships are key with other government agencies, with other private academia and research communities. Continuously assess and learn about new technologies that are becoming available, hand new requirements to those researchers so they continuously develop new capabilities for us to use within the wildfire community. And one of the things I like to talk about is working with my National Guard partners. One of the things that we've learned is everything we've talked about today, incident awareness assessment, in their world, they refer to it as intelligence when they're on the battlefield. And they have a saying that they use where they use the term intelligence for this. I'm going to use incident awareness and assessment or actionable intelligence. It's worthless if our leadership does not receive it. So that goes back to those communication infrastructures, breaking down those barriers and being able to get the information to our leadership and to our boots on the ground. It's worthless if it's not understood. So are we putting the information into a format and bite-sized pieces of information so those boots on the ground that have to bring that information in, understand it, and can use it? And the last one is, can they use it? So are we putting this information into formats that they can receive on their mobile device if they're on the fire line, or if they're working at a dispatch center and move resources around, or if they're working at larger scale, such as a geographic center or here at NIFC, and looking at the situation as a whole and where are we going to be able to move firefighters around? We really have to focus on how can we break down some of these policy and infrastructure barriers that we have to moving and sharing information, process the data and get it into bite size of information so our leadership and our firefighters can be more effective and efficient at their jobs. And with that, I thank you and look forward to further discussions with you. I appreciate your time.
Great. Sean, thank you very much. All right, Deborah, we're going to move on to you.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here. So I'm going to try to share my screen as well. Let's see if I can do that. Are you able to see that?
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me here. It's very exciting to participate in this conversation, important conversation.
Okay. Just a second, Deborah.
Sure.
Is your first slide an inferno with a
Yeah,
rectangle in the
Wildland-
middle? Is that it?
wildland fire planning for the future.
Yeah, okay,
Is that what
that's
you
it. Okay, thank you.
So just a caveat, I'm neither a firefighter nor a scientist, although I work with scientists here at Stanford and around a variety of legal and policy solution issues in the environmental field, and most recently have been spending some time on wildfire issues here in California. But I think some of the things we're hearing, the lessons we're learning are scalable across the country, the West and the country, and probably elsewhere in the world. So I'm going to, because of the work I'm doing, I'm going to pivot our conversation a little bit away from incident response, which is obviously very important and probably most on folks' mind today, and then focus my few minutes on, how we think about planning for the future. So there are many difficult challenges in trying to figure out how to best implement management strategies that mitigate the amount and impacts of wildfire. And in truth, as you've heard, significant wildland fire is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. So really the operative question here is, how do we minimize risks and reduce adverse impacts to the extent possible? So to structure our conversation, I wanted to think about putting these various issues into a couple of buckets that I'll just really quickly identify. We could talk again for hours about these topics too, and then maybe there'll be time in the Q&A to follow up. So one of those buckets is areas of consensus, and I think there are some emerging areas of consensus, and I think those are important as kind of the baseline for how we think forward in terms of management strategies. But then the second bucket is areas of remaining controversy, sometimes increasing controversy, and I'll identify those because I think it's important to think about those in terms of the overall management regime as we go forward, because those kind of controversies can often lead to gridlock. And we're facing this every fire season now, all year round in terms of these fires. And so trying to think our way out of some of the gridlock that's happening, I think is an important approach. And then I'll just wrap up with a few closing thoughts on that. So areas of consensus. I think that there's general agreement that my talk's going to be mostly focused on forests, because that's where the fires are happening in the West. Our past management of forested areas has been largely one of suppression over the last 75 to 100 years. And I think for various reasons that was done. And, that was the thinking at the time. And I think, where we are today is that most people, wherever you are on these issues, think that, that practice has now led us to the situation where we have forests, some of which have significantly increased fuel loads on them, and so therefore become these management risks out there. So that's a thinking about how we move forward is important. But I think there is general consensus about that idea. We, also, as you heard, the climate's becoming hotter, water becoming more scarce in the West. Our forests are stressed, and it makes them increasingly vulnerable to wildfire events. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, historically, there were some big fire events too, before we started managing for fire suppression, but we're just going to continue to see some of these large fires, and how do we deal with them? I want to bring up the issue of smoke, because I've been doing a fair amount of work around smoke. So these large wildfires, all wildfires can put smoke, your campfire can put smoke into the air, but especially uncontrolled wildfires are generating smoke that is having and can be having health impacts on our nearby communities. And in many areas, the communities most affected are communities of color, low-income communities, like the most vulnerable communities. So we don't want to lose in thinking about management going forward, the idea of what do we do about some of those health impacts as we're facing these ongoing challenges. And then lastly, I think an area of consensus is that hardening structures and building defensible space around structures, I think is general agreement that that's a good thing. And I hope the firefighters on the panel today they know all of this and do all of this all the time. I think the concerns about that is how do we make more of that happen as we go forward, and how do we get more of those protections built in? Okay, so areas of controversy. So these are the harder ones. Fuel management, reducing and removing vegetation from the forest is an important and ongoing issue, but it's an area of controversy because there's historic practices, there's proposals to go forward. There are people all across the spectrum, and this has led to some gridlock. There's litigation going on around much of these management strategies. There's a way to look forward into the future, and I think one of the things I would say is that we're we've had a historic way of going about it, which is to use a kind of private resource management, bringing them into public lands or on the private lands that they own, and looking at commercial thinning as a way to try to get rid of some of the excess vegetation on our forests. And that may be a solution in some cases, but I think we need to think really carefully about whether commercial thinning is always the best way to go about it, and the question of whether these forests that we want to try to bring back to some kind of ecological health, ecological balance, whether there are different ways of going about the necessary removal of vegetation where that's makes sense from a fire management perspective. And that might be pouring more resources into it and not using it as a way to get more timber off the forest, because in fact, if you want private companies to do this work, that's often taking out merchantable timber, which is what they want, understandably, but that may not be the best thing for our forest, because it's the mature trees that really keep the forest cooler and damper and really protect the wildlife that's there. Another controversial area is prescribed burning. So I think that most people are on board with how do we bring some fire back to the land. We actually need, in some sense, more fire, not less. We just need it not in these huge wildfires, but we need to bring it back as a management tool. Then the tribes, the indigenous people did this quite well, but are not really in a position to do it on a large scale. So prescribed burning is a technique that's getting more and more of a look. And I know down in Florida, it's used much more, say, than in some of the Western states. I think that's an area that's ripe for conversation. The question is, how do you scale it up? It's obviously in a way sort of resource and personnel intensive, because you don't want these these prescribed fires to get out of control. And there's, public skepticism and concern. There are liability issues. So how do we scale it up to something that could actually help manage for us? And then prescribed burning is different than what I think of as kind of backcountry burning. So, where should we be letting backcountry fires that are not necessarily threatening communities? Where should some of that be allowed to happen? I know the Forest Service is using a policy around that, but the public gets very concerned, and that's how these issues get contentious. We had a fire out here, the Tamarack fire in California, where I think the Forest Service was just watching it, and then it blew up, and it happens, and then a lot of blowback from the public about, well, you should have managed this, even though it made really little sense to go in there and put firefighters at risk in very backcountry terrain. So, thinking about that, where does that fit versus prescribed burning versus thinning of forests? And then the fourth area of controversy is post-fire salvage logging, and happy to talk more about that during the Q&A. But this is most of those efforts get tied up in court between various stakeholders and interests that are out there. So. And there's a question in the science about whether or not doing a lot of logging in post-fire environments is actually reducing fire risk or increasing fire risk. I think we want to rethink all of those categories. And then just on the urban wildland urban interface side of things. This is where communities are up against vulnerable lands that might be vulnerable to fire. Home hardening, obviously, as I mentioned, it's an important area, and the studies show it's incredibly effective, right? So you can get local governments are often passing local regulations these days that new construction in these areas has to meet those high fire protection standards. But what do we do about the millions of structures that are sitting in the wildland urban interface that are not up to those codes? And it's important as we can see these wind-driven fires and embers as being an important vector for the wildfire spread. How do we protect these areas? How do we get those homes hardened? And there's all kinds of ways to think about it, but it's not inexpensive to do that and to get people to do that. So I think, and that can be controversial in a sense of who's going to pay for that. And then lastly, post-fire rebuilding. So there may be some communities where it doesn't make sense to go back and rebuild again. That may not be everywhere that we see fires, but in certain fire-prone areas, again, very controversial if you're a landowner there and you want to go back and rebuild your house. So those are areas that I think we need to think about as a policy matter in trying to design strategies that for better protection in the future. So I'll just close with this. How do we move forward? In my view, we need a culture shift on some of these issues. So 3 points. One is that one size does not fit all. So it depends on where you are. If you're in the urban areas, if you're in the wildland urban interface, different remedies there than maybe in the backcountry, right? And how do we scale for each of those areas and think about it that way? And the public controversies around each of those, how do we manage and how do we educate people about that? Two, I think that there's money going to be flowing both from the federal government and the states. At least in California, there's money now flowing for wildland fire issues. And so how do we spend that money? So one is to spend it on better firefighting resources, and I think that's important. But it also may be we want to spend that money on hardening homes and creating defensible space in our communities. But we also want to think about, should some of that money be going to protect, for instance, children in vulnerable schools, putting in HEPA filters and air conditioners. We here in the Central Valley in California, those populations are being hit over and over again by smoke inhalation. It's a serious problem in the Central Valley. So, how do we, maybe we spend some money on that. It seems a little far afield, but it actually is directly related. And then, how do we spend the money to reduce fuels? Should we gear up that spending of resources and not just leave it to the private sector through timber sales? And then second, on that point, I would say that there's emerging science, and I think Rod's going to talk about some of the cutting edge science. So that's going to help us also think about how do we manage in the future, and we ought to be integrating that science into our management strategies. And then lastly, I'll just say I think there is room for some regulatory reform. So for instance, around prescribed burning is not really happening in a significant way on the West Coast, and I know California best, but it's in part because we don't have a history of it here, so the regulators are a little skeptical. There's potentially environmental review procedures to go forward. So I think we should think about, and we here have started to think about some modest reforms that would allow at least us to begin experimenting more with those kind of prescribed and indigenous burning and getting the local agencies to cooperate. So I think there's a lot there, a lot to think about, and I look forward to conversation in the Q&A. Stop sharing the screen here.
Okay, Deborah, thank you very much for those insightful comments. And finally, we are going to move on to Rod.
Great. Let me get my screen to share. I had it shared earlier. It's now lost somewhere. There it is. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to for the invitation to speak with you today. The one take-home message I'd like to emphasize off of this slide is that the work and ideas that I'm presenting are a contribution for a variety of colleagues, especially out of the burgeoning partnership with the U.S. Forest Service and USGS and others. So I definitely want to emphasize the value of cross-agency, cross-discipline partnerships with regard to pushing forward wildland fire science as a broad topic. So I wanted to start by just giving a little bit of context about wildland fire modeling. And I'm going to start with what are some of the challenges? Why isn't this solved? There's been research on fire and combustion for a long time. Why is this still challenging us? And there's several things that contribute to that. One of which is the very large range of spatial and temporal scales that the important phenomena that drive wildfires take up. Everything from ignition of individual fuel particles out to weather scales. And for anybody that spent time doing computing and modeling, they know that that's a really big challenge. And so we're not at the point where we can use a single model to calculate all that huge range of time and space scales. So that's a really important thing to recognize. We have different models focusing on different regimes of that time and space scale spectrum. The other part of this is that there are a variety of coupled processes that make up what we call wildland fire. Everything from the turbulence in the winds to the heat transfer to the ignition processes to incredibly complex chemistry. And so getting it right for all situations is a challenging it's a challenging obstacle. And so there's a lot of work being done on how do we discern what's most important for what kind of fires. The other thing to keep in mind is these aren't built environments. These are natural environments with a wide range of dynamic and heterogeneous fuels, as well as the dynamics in the atmosphere themselves. That causes significant challenges for setting up modeling problems and having the right inputs and boundary conditions for those tools. Another thing I'd really like to emphasize here is that not all wildland fires are the same. We've got the intense fires that everybody thinks about. Those are the California wildfires in recent years have been great examples of those, or poor examples of those. Unfortunate examples, I should say. But those are often driven by very strong drivers, such as high winds, steep topography, really dense or continuous fuels. And those contributing factors are oftentimes at landscape scales. You've got large areas of steep slopes or large areas of these contiguous fuels. Once these fires hit that high intensity levels, they're relatively resilient to fine scale heterogeneity in the fuels or short-term lulls or gusts in the winds. They've almost got their own momentum, if I can use a word from another field. So they kind of take on their own sustainability, and that makes them that much harder to fight and that much harder to stop with fuel breaks, et cetera. Low intensity fires, on the other hand, these oftentimes lack strong drivers locally, and therefore they depend very much on the local conditions. And breaks in fuel or a lull in the winds, those kinds of short-term or small-scale heterogeneities, they matter a lot, and they can impact whether a fire stops or starts at a given location. And so I should emphasize that even in one given fire, different parts of that fire may be exhibiting these different behaviors. And so we need to think about them. They're not just all the big intense fires. And a lot of the fire that was just spoken about that we want on the landscape is towards the bottom end of this spectrum. So there's also a spectrum of models that are available. And in general, these range from empirically derived, simple, even table-based or chart-based models, such as on the upper left, down to high performance computing based tools down on the lower right that run much slower than real time. And so when we think about these, the other thing that's important to realize is that there is several of these models are leveraging underpinning fire behavior models that were developed back in the early 70s. And so certainly on the upper left, those tools, which are the ones that are most widely used in our operational applications today, are on the upper left, leveraging that early 1970s work of Dick Rothermel. But some of these, such as the ones in the dotted purple circles there, those are examples where these kinds of empirically based fire models have now been coupled to weather models. And that gives additional fidelity to what they can simulate, because now they can capture the movement of a frontal system or something like this, that or a thunderstorm outflow, which might cause dramatic changes in fire behavior, where that's harder to capture without those. So given this spectrum of models, there's all these trade-offs that start to show up. And I don't want to oversimplify that, because there's a lot of different decisions about how these things work out. And I would like to say that there's not a one-size-fits-all model. And we need these different models that work in different regimes better, because maybe you don't have time to wait for a high-performance computing run to get back, or maybe you need the detail that's provided through one of these more complex models. And so there's all of these different trade-offs that need to be weighed as we go forward. I think in thinking about these trade-offs, it's already been brought up in several other previous talks that there are different contexts and different spaces that we're having to make decisions about wildland fire. And I'm using the word wildland fire as opposed to wildfires, because wildland fire is a slightly more general term, which includes things like prescribed fires. So, here's another way to look at it. Some applications, such as real-time fire management support, speed is a big part of that game, right? You've got to have simulations that are coming back much faster than real time to be of any use for decision management. And so that's a really important thing. But if you've got these really strong drivers, a lot of times the models don't have to be as detailed. You don't have to be capturing the three-dimensional structure of the vegetation if it's a strongly wind-driven fire and very thick fuels. So, but on the other hand, some of our applications, like if we're looking at ecosystem sustainability and risk management planning for specific sites, for instance, we need a lot of detail regarding how the fire is interacting with the ecosystem. So that's a lot higher on the complexity and detail requirements, but lower on the simulation speed requirements. And so you can think about all these different applications and think about they might require different kinds of models. One of the things that's as you go towards the upper right, that's probably the most challenging regime, because now you're asking for a lot of speed, and yet you're needing all that detailed work. And so the resource benefit decisions for wildfires, which was just referred to as sort of the backcountry fires, those kinds of decisions, they have, they're A, controversial, and B, they require a lot of science basis to know if we're doing the right thing and if it's safe and how the possible weather behavior is going to affect them. So that's a really challenging regime. I do want to emphasize, and I won't spend much time here, that as we look forward, the next generation fire prediction schemes are going to definitely rely on the coupling between models and all of the data that's coming in. And that's been said in at least two of the talks, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. But we shouldn't think of modeling as an independent thing. It's got to be coupled to situational awareness, whether we're talking about future situations for planning or we're talking about real-time response. Modeling is certainly going to play an evolving role in response-focused decision support. And I think this has already been hit on, so I'll save some time. But I do want to say that, again, it's important to think about modeling integrated with real-time data. How do we plan and forecast both our operations as well as things like evacuations? How do we communicate what we think we understand to each other in the field? This has been hit on at least twice. The other thing I would like to emphasize is that models give us a range, the ability to look at a range of conditions that might evolve over the next hour or days, not just the most likely scenario, but the range of scenarios. Sometimes it's the tails of the possible distributions of fire behaviors that are most devastating and that we really need to watch out for. So thinking about those, and certainly as we move forward, the AI and machine learning have a big role to play in this. So I want to talk a little bit about some other kinds of applications that are less response and more thinking ahead, more proactive. Think about how do we do better risk assessment for specific communities or facilities or infrastructure. How do we look at the risk under current conditions, the influence of mechanical treatments or prescribed fires or combinations of different treatments? But it's also important to be able to think about how do we use models to assess what might happen as climate change continues to drive changes in our landscape, in our fire environments going forward, whether that be moisture or fuel loads, et cetera. So prescribed fire is I think one of the biggest opportunities for advancements in wildfire modeling, because now we're doing something that's very actionable. We're thinking about something that people are going to act on in the future. The more information we can give them, the more ability that they can have to explore what might happen as they light prescribed fires and the after effects. So in thinking about this, it's important to remember that prescribed fires aren't just solitary head fires that are lit and people walk away from them. They are they're well thought out. They're a complex set of ignition patterns, as you see in the simulations on the right side, which are the same simulations, just one's vegetation and one's topography is what's being mapped. They're these complex ignition patterns that are site and condition specific that the burn bosses are having to make decisions on. And the more we can help the burn bosses be able to explore things, well, what if I light it like this? Or what if I light it like that? The easier we make their job, helping them to refine their prescription windows to hit their ecological or risk assessment objectives, thinking about where's the smoke going to go and how do their ignition patterns affect that smoke trajectory. Smoke is actually one of the biggest impediments to prescribed fire in many communities. And what are the contingency plans? Where are things likely to escape? There's a small escape in this fire that's being simulated. Actually, there's a couple. And how do we manage that? Where do we place resources to help manage that? So if we're thinking about things like prescribed fires, where we can plan ahead, or wildfire scenarios and risk assessment, being able to use ensembles and run a wide range of scenarios. Here was an ensemble that was run by UCSD under an NSF grant for the prescribed fire simulation that I just showed you a minute ago. And you can see a variety of fuel and wind conditions here for the same landscape and the same ignition pattern, but under different conditions, they're getting vastly different fire behavior. And being able to explore that and understand, gee, if the fuel's a little bit drier, I might want to adjust my ignition pattern in this way, or under these conditions with these slopes, I just can't do it. Those are important capabilities as we go forward. Being able to think about how does either wildfire or prescribed fire or combinations of mechanical treatments and prescribed fire, how do those affect the longevity and sustainability of my ecosystems is also a really important thing as we go forward. So how does fire behavior couple with ecological effects, which couples with hydrology and plant succession? And what does that look like in years going forward, especially if we start to consider the effects of climate change? On the plot on the lower left, it's a cartoon showing that we can allow time to go on and not burn at all or not do any treatments, in which case we might get a wildfire scenario, which is the red line, which causes drastic changes in the landscape that may never come back to the way they were before. Whereas there's options to do more sustained, proactive management of those landscapes with prescribed fire or treatments or whatever, which may cause the green line, which is a finer tooth saw, if we want to call it that, which keeps us inside some desired range of sustainability for the ecosystem. Being able to look at scenarios that are low frequency but very high consequence fire events. Here we've got a downwash event, which might be, say, from a thunderstorm outflow. And those downwash events happen in nature all the time. But when they happen, they create a backspinning motion in the atmosphere that drives some interesting behavior when they intersect with a wildfire. So on the left was just an illustration of that outflow being formed. But on the right, the two simulations, they're the same simulation, but being able to think about how does that backflow stretch out the fire line, and those are important things to build into our operational tools and to make sure that we're aware of that rapid escalation of the fire as it goes forward. So there's a big opportunity for artificial intelligence and machine-guided learning. We can use some of the more complicated fire models through AI and machine-guided learning or physics-guided machine learning to enhance our fast-running tools, to do a better job of characterizing our environment, to do optimization. If we think about landscape treatments or ignition patterns for prescribed fires. The other thing that was brought up earlier, and I think it's a very good point, is how do we improve our detection? Well, one thing is we can use machine learning and AI to do a better job of scanning imagery and looking for very faint signals of smoke, for instance, in imagery that's being collected. So I do want to give one more example here of a way that we can be thinking about using the spectrum of models to feed each other. This is a case where we're using FireTech, which is one of these HPC-based simulators, to look at basic fire behavior. This is a grass fire that's burning. It's moving towards us. The colors that you see are the part of the wind vector that is pointed towards the viewer or away from the viewer. So the blue means the winds are being drawn back into that fire, and the reds are coming out at us. And the reason this is interesting is going to show up in just a minute. You can see as the fire approaches that white line where the wind vectors are in that plane, what's happening is the character changes. Now, this character right now that you can see is the essence of what drives fire behavior in many situations. So by looking at that fundamental physics, we can back up and use that to drive improvements in our fast-running tools. So I'm going to close with this list of issues that I think are really important to think about. First of all, wildland fire modeling is multidisciplinary. I've got a short list there. There's a lot more that goes into that. Second thing is that advanced modeling efforts will need advanced data sets. And I know that folks like the USGS and US Forest Service are working really hard to get at that next generation of fuels data, for instance, and being able to characterize the three-dimensional structure of the vegetation, not just the fuel type. which becomes really important when we want those more detailed answers. And the last thing I do want to say is that this is wildland fire science advancement really should be done in partnership with the wildland fire management community. I think it's a mistake for the science communities to run off on their own and not stay in very close, continuous partnership with the people that actually use the tools and know what they're doing. That's where I'm going to leave that.
Great. Okay, fascinating, Rod. Thank you very much. Okay, so you've all been very efficient with using your time. So we have a lot of time for discussion here, which is great. I'm going to start off with just a couple of questions while the members think about what they'd like to ask, and maybe I'll start with Dustin for an easy one. Dustin, when you have firefighters out in the field, do you know where they all are? I mean, do you have GPS tracking of them? I mean, if you want to get them good information and you have good information, presumably you want to know kind of exactly where they are so they could be acting upon the information in that local area.
I would say you're completely right. Yes, we would want to know where they are so that if we had good perimeters and good intel, we could deploy them appropriately. That's one of our major issues is, as an example, I have a fairly robust tracking system where I know where all of my apparatus are. So I know where all of my engines are. I do not have a tracking system that allows me to know where all of my people are. We use a GPS enabled tracker inside of each of their individual radios, but that only allows us to track our people on our incidents within our, I guess, data collection area or geospatial area. When they go out and help somebody else, I lose that ability. And then when we utilize mutual aid and bring all of our neighbors, state and federal partners in, we can't track any of their information or their resources to deploy them.
Okay, this sounds like a solvable problem. So
you would think.
Yeah. Okay, we're on it. Maybe one for Sean before we take some questions from others. Sean, if someone comes up with a new idea or a new capability, is there a established process or pathway for assessing that and then leading it on a pathway that it can become operational?
Excellent question. And unfortunately, no, there's not. We actually recently met with a DoD partner who was interested in supporting Wildfire. They weren't trying to sell us a technology or a capability. They asked, is there a mil spec or like a DoD type standard for a technology coming into the wildfire space? And the simple answer is no, there's not. It's program by program, idea by idea specific.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's see, John DeBerry, you want to start us off?
Thank you, and thanks to all of you for your presentations. One of the common themes that I heard from each of you was the idea that on the one hand, there's a desire for common operating pictures that could be shared in fires happening in Florida versus Alaska or in California. On the other hand, you also emphasize the fact that each fire is unique, that they need different tools in various cases. So can you help us think about how we could develop tools that accomplish both goals, that are widely disseminated to fire crews anywhere in the country, but that have this flexibility that they're able to respond to the diversity of fires that you're seeing?
Yeah, John, I'll tackle that first. What you're describing is kind of gets to the root of the point I was making with data interoperability and integration. We know, from a local perspective, what happens in Ventura County does not transfer well to East Texas in terms of their operation and firefighting. But what we can agree upon nationally is developing common standards. And when you build, for example, the previous question about tracking, we know there's, probably 100 some devices out there that we could put on firefighters to track them. the hard part then is how do you take those different data feeds, put them together? And so as mutual aid resources were to enter an area, we could turn those tracking feeds on and have them work. And when those tracking feeds or those mutual aid resources leave, we could turn those tracking feeds off. So that goes back to data interoperability and integration. Build those common data standards. So any of our data sets that need to be transferred or moved across the country, that common operating picture can talk to another common operating picture, and we can share and move data between them. That's really a very simple way to tackle this. And we've done that with other programs. We have an existing program called Automated Flight Following, which has, I believe, 7 or 8 different types of vendors that provide iridium tracking location of aircraft. But as a whole, from the fire enterprise, we've agreed to a common set of data themes that those tracking devices need to share information as. So then we can quickly integrate that information into a system and move it amongst our different platforms.
Eric Horvitz, you're next.
Thanks, and thanks, Dustin, Deborah, Sean, and Rod. Fabulous, interesting presentations. Dustin and Sean, first, I have a few questions. I mean, what is there a community of sharing bespoke fire-centric applications, whether they be tracking and prediction, where firefighters across the nation can sort of talk about best tracking tools, best practices? And are there bespoke tools developed from commercial applications of various kinds versus just using off-the-shelf things right now and cobbling them together by community by community? My first question.
I would say there are a number of groups or associations that work together. As an example, in California, we have FireScope, which is a group that formed in the 70s to develop incident command and interoperable radios, mutual aid response. And it's a way that the California Fire Service communicates. There are the NIFC community through the U.S. Forest Service is a group that sends a lot of information out, but there is no one standard. And as Sean was saying, that's one of the hard parts, is we're all using different technology that, yes, we're buying off the shelf. We've tried to cobble some of our own stuff together, but again, we can only use that in our environment and we can't share it. Yeah. We've been working for years trying to get just our computer automated dispatch centers, our CAD systems that work on resource tracking with GPS to share across boundaries. And we haven't been able to tackle that problem yet.
Thanks. And just as a lead into a question for Rod, given all the work going on for decades now, and I've tracked some of this, and it's great hearing an update today from Rod on modeling and prediction, optimization, resource usage, various applications, as Rod pointed out. How much of that is actually in use beyond the computer science and modeling and simulation laboratories today, from the perspective of Dustin and Sean and Deborah? Do any firefighting groups use the modeling and simulation tools today?
So as I mentioned, there's a full range of modeling that's available, and if you think about that chart I showed, where up on the upper left, you have some empirically based stuff that's really rooted in the 1970s. It's used very widely across in a variety of communities. As you go towards the lower right of that diagram and you go to some of the more detailed and newer stuff, folks like the USGS, folks like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for instance, are really pushing to try to start, beta testing, and they're using it to explore some things. And so I'm excited about the fact that there is a user base that's growing into it. NSF is funding an accelerator project at UCSD to take these things and incorporate it into decision support tools for initially for California, but then beyond. So I think the growth and use is starting to catch hold. I think for a long time the computing requirements were something that were limiting somebody access. And so now the fact that a lot of that information is now coming down to things that are not so computationally intensive is helping to accelerate some of the use of the newer tools.
And my last related question, this comes from my experience in the machine learning community, AI community, to build a deep and rich data set, let's say 50 years of fires coupled with atmospheric data, ecology, hydrology, make that available to researchers and engineers. For one, you could take any of your models and test it over 50 years on thousands of fires to see how well they do with all that information, including real-time considerations simulated from that data set, or develop new models and refine them and make better models. So I'm curious, what's the status of a big standard large-scale workload of data and test of fires with coupled data across all the environmental factors that might be existing, the atmospheric conditions and so on, that could be used for model testing and refinement?
I would say it's very immature to almost non-existent. And I'll tell you, the reason why is because data characterizing the fire environment that results in the fire behavior that we can see is actually a fairly significant undertaking, even if you're doing a fire experiment. If you think about it, you've got to do a good job of characterizing the fuels. You've got to do a good job of characterizing the winds, including the variability of the winds. And the winds isn't just a single vector, right? It's a three-dimensional field. And so depending on what kind of fire it is, again, if you're drifting towards large, intense wildfires, the small variations in the winds don't matter that much. But if you're talking about prescribed fires, now you're talking about a situation where the variation in the winds matters a lot. And so organizations like CERTA have actually been really pushing on getting some of that data collected and archived and put in a robust platform, but that can be used for exactly what you said. Unfortunately, it's slow coming. And unfortunately, based on your question, unfortunately for wildfires, the big scary ones, people aren't really thinking about taking data. They're thinking about the life and death type decisions that need to be made at that time. And so unfortunately, we're not quite at the point where you're suggesting we should be. And I totally agree with it. Would be nice.
Oh, and just to say, I was suggesting something maybe a little coarser, like satellite data over 50 years with general wind conditions to start with marginal data sets that you consider to average models over to test. But anyway, thanks for your answer. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Great. Bill Press.
Yeah, thanks. In fact, my question follows, I think, nicely on after Eric's. Also to Rod, I was struck when you said that the models that you sort of thought implied were the best ones couldn't be run in real time, were far from being run in real time. And I was struck by the fact that we in this country and the Europeans, essentially, we size the computer requirements to the requirement that weather forecasting be able to be done in real time. And so my question is, how big is that gap? Is that something that with a certain amount of national will and dollars we could bridge and have a national forest forecasting service in real time? Or are we still orders of magnitude away from being able to do that?
So, of course, as computer speeds have come along, we've made a lot of progress towards that. And the quick fire simulations that I showed that were being used for a lot of the prescribed fire stuff, those models are running approximately real time. And I'll say approximately because it depends on the scenario. Fire tech is still maybe an order of magnitude, but it's not using, it's not maxing out the computer capabilities that we have, and it's not going to exascale, for instance, or anything like that. So I think it's possible to get to the speeds that you're wanting. The challenge is if you're having 50 users trying to run the model at the same time for 50 different fires across the West, you need 50 times that amount of computing resources. So I think we can get, it's not impossible by any means, but it would take a concerted effort for the most detailed, for the WFDS and the fire tech style models. However, quickfire, for instance, was designed specifically to enable ensembles that could run in real time, but try to capture that three-dimensional fuel structure and things like that. So it's almost, it's not the most detailed, but I think it's getting close to where you want to be.
Great, thank you. I have Sue Desmond-Hellman next.
Thank you. Thank you all for excellent presentations. I had a question for Deborah. You talked about planned fires, planned burns, and specifically talked about Indigenous people and some of the tradition and history in that area. What I'm struggling with, because I'm from out west, so we hear a lot of controversy about that wildfire shouldn't have happened. We needed these prescribed burns, or that burn got out of control, and that's why we had the wildfire. And I find myself nervous if this was my job to decide on a planned burn, I would default to never do it because you can only cause trouble. So my question is, what have we learned from studying the history of this? And are there any parameters, models? Is there a path that you can follow to do some wildfire prevention in a predictable way?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So a couple of things. I think there is more and more interest among Indigenous communities to do more of this. And that was my sense is we need to make it easier for them to do it, right? So that's a small piece of it. And it's fascinating working with those folks, the knowledge, not all tribes, but the tribes that have carried this forward, the knowledge that they bring about the precisely the right time to do it, what are the impacts on the ecosystem is phenomenal in a way that I think probably none of the rest of us could ever replicate. But then when you think about it on a larger scale for private burn bosses, right, who, and I know some of those folks, I mean, they're not necessarily well paid. They do it because they believe in it. There are all kinds of scary liability issues, right? There are, and one of the things that we're seeing happen in California is, so CAL FIRE, the state agency, if a prescribed fire is done in under the auspices of CAL FIRE, there are some liability protections that kick in, and so for these burn bosses, they're mostly quite interested in doing it under that rubric. And the problem is with especially as we have more wildfire going on, the problem is that it's a very slow process. So it might be years to get in the queue to be working with CAL FIRE to get your prescribed burn done, even if it's relatively small, and that has to do with a lot of factors. So I think one of the things that we want to think about is, and we are thinking there's continuing to be legislative push to put some protections in place, and that would it would reduce liability concerns or some way to address those concerns, especially if we want to see it. So some of the most interesting players are some of the land conservancies that are trying to do it on their own, conserved property, right? And but I do think we need to, if we really want to use this at a bigger scale, we really want to think about those liability issues and how we can get and there, there's training going on for these burn bosses and stuff, but it's not, there's a huge amount of risk there. And so how do we open the door a bit to, and so that's some of the stuff we're working on to make those folks feel more comfortable going forward. I think that's important to do.
Right, thank you.
Can I add to that? Just
Certainly.
I think one of the, if we think about these proactive measures that we're going forward with, obviously we're in a different decision and responsibility space than the reactionary than a reactionary approach to wildland fire. And so I think whether we're doing mechanical treatments or lighting prescribed fires, or doing, as it was referred to earlier, the backcountry, letting fires burn when we think they're having resource benefits. Whatever we're doing there, I think the need for a strong science basis to underpin our decisions and to be able to say, we've done our homework the best we possibly can becomes increasingly important, whether it's to defend ourselves in case of somebody questioning us, or just so that we make sure we're doing the right thing. This is an actionable space as opposed to reactions. And so the science is really necessary to back those things up and make sure we're doing it right.
Great. Kathy Wotecki.
Thank you. My question is for Sean Triplett, and it is the following. When there is a wildfire and the Forest Service deploys one of your incident management teams to the site, from the data systems that you've described to us, how is that information actually shared in the moment on the scene with these other diverse organizations that are also involved in fighting the fire?
And thanks for that question. So first off, when an incident management team is ordered, that's all handled at the local level. So those units that are responsible to manage that wildfire. And so they set up an incident command post, and those teams come in. And through the ICS system, we have logistics, operations, planning, and public information and finance. And those different units or command structure within ICS have IT applications that where we are collecting and managing data. And then they all have different reporting processes where they send the information up to, then it's aggregated and shared. So you have the public information area that is sharing information out to the public. You have the finance, which is doing accruals and capturing data about financial situation, daily costs, flight hours for aircraft, things like that, and moving that up. Operations is working very closely with the planning section on looking at what the fire is doing. So the planning section's providing current fire situation, the weather, the models that Rod has talked about, and getting that information over to ops. And then ops is working to decide what resources they need to continue to move forward. And then plans is helping them get those resources. So all of our systems are designed to either be web-based, operate in a cloud, to where they can be forward deployed and work in the field, but are talking back to central servers so they can share information and report up. And then we have very standard defined reporting processes. So we have, an incident command 209, which is a snapshot once a day to move things up. We have our dispatch and geographic area coordination system that has reporting processes, depending on what the fire situation is, to move the information up. All that is happening, as I go back earlier, because we've built common standards for reporting, and we've built common standards for moving data back and forth to support those operational decisions and data flows. And so the short answer is we have systems that are built to track the information that's in those different incident command organizations. And then they also all have associated reporting processes to move the data up. Now, where we kind of get a little sideways is sometimes we ask the system to produce information it really wasn't designed to do. So like Dustin earlier was talking about our resource ordering system. At times people try to use that to look at drawdown and resource availability. But there's a lot of different factors that go into calculating, that information, and so that system, like Dustin says, really designed to move resources back and forth. I need XYZ, I order it and it shows up. Doesn't really give you a real-time statusing of what that resource's availability is to come to you and support you in fire and or when it returns. So simple answer, cloud-based systems that are designed to be forward deployed. And, we basically build a city. We can walk into a field full of cow pies and stand up a whole city to feed firefighters, to support firefighters, have all the IT infrastructure we need. And then we scale that up and down based on the need. And then we will move away when the fire's done.
Great. Andrea Goldsmith.
Hi, I think this question is for Dustin and Sean, but if others want to weigh in, that would be great. So my question is, do you currently use robots or drones or autonomous vehicles in how you fight fires? And if the engineering community could build these for you of any size with advanced mechanics and dexterity, enabled with machine learning and optimization and decision-making, how might you use that to fight fires?
I'm going to say that's going to be a Sean question. From an end user, we are willing to use them. We will certainly deploy them. They are becoming more and more available, and they're becoming more and more available out of their shop, and we're seeing great benefits from them. But your level of questioning, that's a Sean question.
So Dustin's right. So we have a very robust unmanned program. It's a partnership between the Department of Interior and the Forest Service. We're continuously evolving how we use those unmanned systems. Initial push for the unmanned systems was to get them up and do the imaging and the mapping of the fire. And now we're looking at how they can act as comm relay towers for us. We're using them quite extensively right now in the Southeast to actually support prescribed fire operations. So instead of having helicopters fly low and slow, we are putting unmanned systems up to help ignite fires and put fire on the landscape in that prescribed fire situation. We also work very closely with our state partners who are putting up unmanned systems for us to use when we're fighting fire. We do have a partnership with NASA right now and the FAA, but specifically with NASA, where we're evaluating a universal traffic management system, which is basically allowing us to build a real-time situational awareness airspace within the cone over top of the fire, so we can put manned and unmanned systems operating simultaneously and deconflicting with each other. I know we've also evaluated helicopters to run logistics missions, so an optionally pilot aircraft to fly supplies out to the different areas where fires where it's needed. From an operational perspective, there's all kinds of things that could be done. I know one time we had remote controlled bulldozers out there to try to do some different work, but the biggest struggle right now, especially with anything that comes off the ground, is coordinating the airspace and working. It's not only with the FAA and the deconfliction, it's the frequencies. All these things need radio communications. And as Dustin can tell you, frequencies get overwhelmed very quickly when we have a very extensive initial attack or large fire or multiple fires burning in the same area. So it's kind of two components there: one, airspace management, and two, frequency management.
So
Actually,
can I add one more thing to that? There is additionally some burgeoning research about using drones, for instance, to get much more detailed fuels information, as well as, and you can think of that, once you have an incident that you need to look ahead for, but you can also think of that in a prescribed fire or other contexts as well.
So follow-up question. You mentioned the frequencies get overwhelmed. My specialty is actually wireless communication. Is that an area where you need better technology to be able to communicate? And then also, it seems like there isn't a lot of focus on terrestrial robots and vehicles. And I'm wondering why, as a kind of someone not familiar with this area, seems to me like there could be a lot of value to things on the ground that are automated and unmanned.
Okay, I'll handle the first question. Frequencies. Yes, frequencies are always a problem. So there's just your standard push-to-talk frequencies that we're struggling with, and of course you have your air-to-ground frequencies and that's just simple communication infrastructure. And then there's also the wireless communication that you're talking about. We've done testing with MAN-A or mesh networking, Bluetooth-enabled devices to share location and communication deprived areas, which is most of the areas that we operate in for firefighting. One of the big hurdles that we had to get over just to do pilot programs of flying high altitude aircraft was the frequency management. Putting a 5-watt broadcaster up at 50,000 feet gets people a little nervous. And so you have to, there's a lot of things that have to go through there. And several years ago, we did an optionally piloted test in California, actually out of Monterey Airport, and the hurdles we had to go over just to get a temporary waiver to do some frequency management in that area. Again, high traffic areas, San Jose, San Francisco, Oakland airports. We were able to do it, but that was kind of a one-time shot. For the terrestrial side, again, that's not really my expertise. I know, there has been testing, like I said earlier, with bulldozers. I'm not sure if Dustin knows of anything with like water tenders or engines, but I would imagine, it's probably something that anyone would be interested in. But considering the terrain and conditions we operate in, it would be very interesting to see how that program or project came about. From a resource perspective, it's one of those is the juice worth the squeeze kind of things. If we had to look to put where our efforts are going to be, right now, just trying to get the unmanned systems in the aircraft or in the aviation world is a big focus of ours. And dedicating more resources to look at terrestrial. Not going to turn down the offer, but something we'd be interested in.
Yeah. Okay, I've got Joe Chiani next. Joe.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you for excellent and complimentary presentations. My question is, what percentage of the wildfires are due to arson, power lines, lightning, and is there a economic viability in burying the power lines if they are a big part of the problem?
I'd say I can probably start with that. It's a really good question, and one we, of course, watch a lot. I can speak for Southern California, where the large majority of our fires are, we'll say they're man-caused, whether it be from vehicles, careless human activity, or left campfires, or arcing electrical equipment. The 95+% of our fires are caused by humans, by human interaction, and not by dry lightning, as you see across most of the Rockies and the Sierras. There are advantages to burying lines, of course. A high majority of our electrical fires are caused by line-to-line arcing in the wind, or lines touching, or transformers blowing. And I know I can't speak about PG&E because we don't work with them, but Southern California Edison, who covers my region of Southern California, they are definitely focusing energy on that, on hardening their grids, on hardening their connections, on burying critical lines, on monitoring them. They're definitely a partner in this space. I think through liability reasons, they've really joined in a partnership with public and private entities. So it's definitely something to look at.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, we do have a partnership with the Department of Energy, specific to Oak Ridge National Lab. It started out as a sensor program. They were actually building a sensor to detect asbestos in the fire. So when you get fires burning up in the vermiculite in Northern Rockies, where we have abandoned asbestos mines, that's another environmental hazard in all its own.
Wow.
That actually morphed over into them doing some testing and sensor based to look at power lines and looking at through the multispectral scanners where the metal was fatigued or the lines were having issues. And as Dustin mentioned, PG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, Edison, Bonneville Power. I know the power company here in Colorado, the Idaho Power, where I live here in Idaho. All of them are very concerned about this, and all of them have taken a lot of efforts to mitigate this. And back to your earlier question about the human-caused fire, I think a good way to look at that, and I think the statistic that we all like to use from Smokey Bear is for every $1 spent on prevention saves us $2 in suppression. I'm not an economist, but those are good numbers. And so I think we could, prevention is a program that always can be looked at with our fields and mitigation of reducing the chains dragging behind trailers and things like that start fires.
I'll just jump in on the Northern California. So PG&E, which has been found to be the source of various wildfires over the last few years, and obviously there's a big liability issue there. But they've announced that they're going to do undergrounding of, I think, about 10,000 miles of lines. And the part of the controversy is before the California Public Utilities Commission, and who bears those costs, right? Is it the shareholders, ratepayers? Because that's an expensive proposition, and I don't know what percentage that is of their overall infrastructure, but it is a start to that. And I think as well, most of the fires in Northern California are human caused, including ones that are not by the utilities, but just sparking incidents because people are people are in the forested areas, and so humans are the source of most things.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marvin Adams.
So we know there have been a large number of very large and high intensity fires in recent years. So those things have obviously consumed a lot of fuel. And in the meantime, drought conditions and so on have created more fuel continuously. Is there more fuel now or less than 5 years ago? Not sure who that's for. And I understand that the answer is going to differ by locality, but I'm thinking across the West as a whole.
I'll take a stab at it, and then Dustin, I'll turn it to you. But I recently just read an article about the heat dome that went over the Pacific Northwest this year in areas that were traditionally viewed as moist, temperate rainforests, where we don't have a lot of wildfires. And they're already seeing tree stress and mortality in those areas just from the 110 degree plus temperatures. So we're bringing more areas into the fire regime that haven't traditionally been there. The fuels are drying at higher altitudes. So yes, we are seeing fuel loading occurring and fires burning at altitudes they traditionally haven't occurred before. Yes, we have done, we've burned a lot of acres, unfortunately, and we continue to burn a lot of acres, but we're also bringing into play other acres of areas that haven't traditionally burned. And, we've seen recovery where fires go through. And I think back to a fire I was here in Idaho, 2014, where a fire had burned through in the early 90s. And at that time, we used the term, it nuked it, it moonscaped the area. But there was still some dead and down, but that was enough time for the grasses and the shrub to come back. And we had a drought that summer, and that fire got into there and it got going. There's an area there in Southwest Oregon that burned in 2002, and I've been back there twice for fighting fires in that exact same area. And then what Dustin deals down there with the chaparral and the manzanita and everything, rapid regeneration of those areas. Simple answer is I don't think we've seen a reduction. I think we still continue to see increases, especially as the climate changes and dries out areas that traditionally haven't seen fires before. If you really want to think about for your folks back there in the east, Gatlinburg, Tennessee, not traditionally thought of as a wildfire area. The winds and the weather made it a fire area, unfortunately, at one point.
Yeah, the only thing I can add in just following in with Sean is I think because of weather changes, we're seeing more fuel beds and more fuel loads that traditionally we didn't worry about. When we're having 1,000-acre fires in a single night in January above the Bixby Bridge in Monterey, where it's normally raining, where they had just received 27 inches of rain the month before, yet because of the prolonged drying and drought, it burned. I think we're bringing in more fuel beds than we're burning.
Thank you. Terry Tao.
Hi, yes, my question is for Dustin. I'm wondering whether fire departments are generally receptive to embracing these sort of more modern data-driven fire modeling platforms, I guess. I'm thinking an analogy with crime fighting and police departments. I think police departments only embraced sort of data-driven crime mapping and crime modeling because there was a very high-profile experiment in the 90s with the NYPD, which introduced these things, and it simultaneously a very dramatic drop in the crime rate. And that sort of, I think, spurred a lot of other police departments to copy that approach. Has there been kind of a similar success story in the firefighting world of using modeling and to sort of dramatically improve firefighting?
That's a really good question, and I'll say yes. And much like the police department and the experiments you mentioned, it's been a cultural shift. We've seen the information become available, and we've seen when it is available and when it can be used, how useful it can be. And as Sean was describing, we have a very militaristic approach to firefighting through incident command, through the way we set it up, the way we command and control resources, and the command structure is embracing technology and willing to use it and trying to use it and is really hungry to use it. And we use that technology then to deploy the mass majority of the resources on the ground, or the boots on the ground. And I have found that our most traditional boots on the ground tool digging crews are readily accepting drones and aerial resources and technology faster than we can get it to them.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I did a quick detail on the Reading hotshots this year. By far the oldest guy out there. But every firefighter on the crew had a smart device with them. Every firefighter on the crew was checking the weather, checking the situation, embracing the technology. So we've got a huge cultural shift going on.
Great. John DeBerry.
Thanks. I had two questions that sort of span this range from detection to response and suppression. So on the detection side, Sean, you showed the Fire Guard program as one of the success stories there. I wanted you to give us some sense of things that you can't get from that Firefly Fire Guard program, this overhead perspective on the fires, anything it's missing. And then at the other end of the spectrum, and this kind of connects to Terry's question a moment ago, I wondered for the boots on the ground, how much of the barrier is Wi-Fi or GPS or other physical ability to get the information, and how much of it is them being so consumed with fighting the fire that they wouldn't be able to use that kind of data because their attention is occupied by fighting a fire?
That's a great question. So yeah, the Fire Guard, last year was our first operational period of that operation nationwide of the program. Highly successful. But it like everything else, it has its limitations. I'm thermal scientist. Radiation and heat doesn't do very well with water vapor. So anytime you have high levels of humidity or clouds, anything that's going to be trying to do that work is going to have issues. It's not a tactical tool. That's one thing that we let everyone know. It's not designed to make tactical decisions off of. There's still quite a bit of work required by humans in the middle. They're aggregating data from a lot of different resources. So excellent opportunities for automation and working the ways to make the data more progressive in terms of by the time it hits the human, that they don't have to do as much analysis. And so I think, where it really falls short is probably in the automation, very human intensive. Adding additional capabilities to it. As we know, there's more and more resources becoming available between cameras and commercial and our international partners, bringing all that data together to provide a more tactical approach for our end users. And then to tag on to your second question, I go back to that last mile communication. The story I like to tell everybody is I live here in Boise, Idaho. If I'm driving very fast, it's a 8 to 10 hour drive to Missoula, Montana. And there's a lot of forest between here and there. And that total time, I have about 45 minutes of LTE connection. And there's a lot of values at risk between here and there. And so we have very large swaths of the country that don't have even 3G capability to be able to get information pushed out to our firefighters. I fought fire in Florida, the Apalachicola and the Panhandle of Florida. Yeah, it's flat, but you have very dense canopy, and those cell phone signals aren't penetrating that very well. So getting information out to the boots on the ground, that's a huge problem of ours. And so kind of back to my presentation, we can put together all the monitoring and detection technologies out there. But if we can't have an interoperable communication system that reaches out to the pointy end of the spear in military speak, we're not doing anybody any good. So that communication backbone really needs to be upgraded.
Maybe just a quick follow-up. I would have assumed, I guess, in the military that this is a challenge that's been faced, fighting wars overseas in remote locations. So is there a reason we haven't been able to leverage some of that technology?
That's a great question. And we're starting to. So we have been looking at some of the different persistent systems and Silvus and some of those other radios that the military uses. To be brutally honest, it's interoperability and cost. Military they go out and they can set like I said earlier, a mil spec or a standard that says that your systems will communicate this way. And they go out and procure that and make that work. We have to do that in the wildfire community. And so being able to hop between different, S-band, C-band frequencies, things like that, and then providing the programmatic and funding support to do that. We have been in touch with the Blue Force Tracking Program out on Northcom for quite some time. Excellent group of people to work with. And they're awesome because they're like, don't do this. We made that mistake. And so we're like, great, thank you for the input. And so we're trying to move forward with that. That technology is just making it into our space, but it's expensive and it has to be interoperable across the programs. If I went out and I think Dustin touched on it earlier, they rely heavily on mutual aid. And so when those mutual aid programs and engines and folks come into their area, they have to make sure that those radios and tracking devices and everything are operating in the same spectrum so they can communicate with each other. And we've seen that. I think we probably saw that on the Colorado fire this year when when you get into 800 megahertz and the first responders that work in the urban interfaces, and then you bring in the wildland, there's a break right now, and we need to be able to close that gap.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left and 3 questions. So phrase your questions and answers accordingly. Steve Picali, you're up first.
I've been sitting here thinking about, Rod, your answer to Eric's question about why there isn't a catalog of past fires against which you can check the ability of models to predict what they do. And in any field, right, there are very few in which force of intellect can develop a forecasting model. You have to have a data set against which you can assess and develop a skill score. We've seen it again and again and again. And other fields have, especially if they're focused on disasters, have developed extensive operations to do that. That includes forensic work after an event took place, because they acknowledge that it's really difficult in the line of fire to gather all the information you need. Here's the question: has anybody even proposed the system inside the government that would collect that information so that we ultimately will be able to have firefighters looking at their phone and seeing where the fire is likely to go?
I can answer a piece of that. I can't speak for it nationally, but in the state of California, we have a standard data collection and mapping system. We send all the information and data is tracked through CAL FIRE, and then we do use it for modeling. They are using it through the Wildfire program that Rod showed. How old it is and how deep it is, I can't give you that answer. We've been doing it as long as I've been involved in tracking it, but that, how far that goes back, I'm not sure how useful that is in that world.
Okay, Dan Arvizu.
Thank you. Thank you for a very stimulating set of presentations. Question I have has really to do, and maybe it's for Deborah. It was inspired by your comments regarding the fuel management discussion, and specifically having spent a lot of time in Colorado and watching forests begin to change in terms of beetle kill and a number of other environmental impacts that are driven by climate. How does that change the strategy, the long-term strategy of approach to fire mitigation techniques, especially as it relates to fuel management, especially in the vast management areas of the higher country in the Rockies in particular?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll go first. Maybe others have some thoughts about this too. So I don't know the specifics as well in Colorado. I would say we've got similar situation, for instance, in the Southern Sierra, like a lot of beetle kill happening there from the drought in the mid-teens, and now we're back in a drought. Or maybe we never came out. We were just in a little rain lull. But one of the and this goes back to an earlier question. The figure I've seen is that just in California, and we've had some pretty large fires in the last few years, and still there's something like 4 million acres of potentially, more than that, but of identified vulnerable forested areas, right? And so what do we, and getting fire on the landscape will sort, in some cases, reduce the fire risk in the future. But do we let these big fires burn? We've had some pretty catastrophic fires in the Southern Sierra because of all the beetle kill. I would be interested if Rod or others know how to integrate the science in thinking about how to go forward in those areas. So backcountry areas or areas that are not close to communities of people. We're not likely to do a sufficient prescribed burning or frankly enough, thinning to actually really address the question. And, as more and more areas become vulnerable, I think we really need to be using those science models to help us make some predictions about, where and what we should be doing.
So I can comment a little bit about some of the exciting things that have been going on in terms of the research of the interaction between fire and other disturbances, namely insect mortality, for instance. There's actually been quite a bit of work on that. And a lot of it using models, for instance. And the first response is that it's not a one size fits all, and it's actually a very transient set of interactions. And that, for instance, the first, a couple years after the kill, when you've got the red needles on the trees, you have this very flashy environment where fire can spread very intensely and very vigorously due to the fact that you've got these dead needles that are, or dead leaves or needles mostly, I guess, that are high on the trees. Once those needles fall to the ground and you go into what's called the gray stage, but the tree trunks are still standing, you might actually move into an area where you would sustain fire, but it might not be that intense because now all the fuels are on the ground and they start decaying and things like this. But then some of the stuff coming out of British Columbia recently is showing that once those boles of the trees or the tree trunks, once they fall down, now you've got a lot of down large woody material that greatly increases the 100,000 hour fuels. That's the thick fuel on the ground that has long residence times. And when that in extended drought, that can be really cause a big problem. So I think it's a very transient intersection where if wildfires come through at the right time, it might not be that big of an extra hazard, where if it comes through at the wrong time, especially after drought, it can be very severe.
Thank you. Bill Dolly, let's wrap it up here and be succinct. We're over time.
Yeah, so to respond to Rod's comment earlier, I'm curious why satellite communication isn't the answer to monitoring where the firefighters on the ground are. Between Iridium and Starlink, and they're readily available, and Garmin sells this little thing called Inreach for, a couple $100. Yeah, that will send anybody's GPS position to a satellite every 10 minutes. Is there some barrier that keeps that technology from being deployed?
So this past summer, we actually tested and evaluated all those systems. So Starlink, we got out onto a fire and had a very big success with it. And so we're looking this year on how we can continue to use Starlink. When you're talking about those Inreach devices, that is exactly one of the devices we tested. The disadvantage to that is it's a short burst Iridium, so it's pinging back a location. That firefighter carrying that device has no way of knowing where everything else around him. There's just not enough packets to be able to go back and forth on there. There is some high bandwidth satellites that are not, that are readily available. Again, that would incur quite a cost, though, to have that type of communication to go through, like TDRS or some other type of large satellite communication system. So we have tested and evaluated those. There are some limitations to those, but really, a firefighter driving around with a device that pings their location back to the mother strip is not going to reduce the risk or increase the situational awareness of the firefighter on the ground. It has to be bidirectional, and that communication has to be able to support them. So Yep, we've tested those. We've looked at AT&T FirstNet and Starlink and a lot of those different communication systems, but they do have limitations out there. And the big one being just it's a short burst iridium, so you can get across maybe the ID of the ID of the device and a lat long and some other information about it.
Okay, Dustin and Sean, Deborah, and Rod, this has been extraordinarily informative, and you've given us a lot of good ideas for how to help you. So we'll put our heads together, and I'll close the session, but thank you all for your contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to till 3:20. So.
Well, welcome back, everyone. After a brief break, PCAST is reconvening now, and welcome to all of those who are listening. We're going to have a conversation about improving scientific communication. Back in the day, when I thought all it took was for people to have evidence in front of them for rational decisions to be made, I guess I was a bit of a follower of René Descartes. I've recently learned that David Hume won the Super Bowl against René Descartes when he said, "Reason is a slave to the passions." We have seen the passions and what has happened when reason was somehow run over top of, especially in the course of the last 2 years with the experiences with COVID-19 and such things as vaccines and whether they're safe and effective, where even today, 50 million Americans have not yet received their first dose because of fears that this is not safe and effective, fears that have been very much built up by comments on social media, but not always just on social media. So we have a serious issue, despite the government's effort during that very difficult 2 years to promote science communication of valuable, well-validated information. We have not been, in many instances, successful in achieving that with all of the other winds that have been blowing. So we want to see whether there is an opportunity here for PCAST to play some useful role, since we are the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And therefore, if there is something the government could be doing in terms of improving our approaches to science communication to build trust, then that might be a very important thing for us to consider. This is not a conversation, though, that is going to be decorated by the fact that we already have a working group that's done a lot on this. This is very exploratory. I have heard that several of our existing working groups on other topics have highlighted the need for public communication to be better enhanced as part of their work. But today, for this session, we're going to talk specifically about that. And again, specifically about whether there are things government could be doing to make this more effective in building trust and conveying information, and also conveying important issues like the fact that science evolves and that there has to be uncertainty built into almost everything that we conclude scientifically, and we need to somehow be sure that is understood as well. We have a terrific group of 4 speakers who we have asked to come and help us think about this. I will mention all of them now, and then they will come forward with comments, and then we will have time for what I imagine will be a rather vigorous discussion with PCAST members, because I think everybody has a pretty strong sense that this is a really important issue. Our speakers, first we will hear from Arthur Lupia, who is the Gerald R. Ford Distinguished University Professor at the University of Michigan. His research examines how people make decisions when they lack information. His areas of expertise include information processing, coalition building, and science communication. Beyond research, he leads or works with many organizations to develop more effective communication strategies. He will be followed by Consuelo Wilkins of Vanderbilt University, where she is Professor of Medicine and Senior Vice President and Senior Associate Dean for Health Equity and Inclusive Excellence. She studies integrating social, cultural, and environmental factors into clinical and translational research. And engaging racial and ethnic minority communities is one of her focal areas. Then we will hear from Jessica Holman of Northwestern University. She is the Jeannie Rometty Associate Professor of Computer Science at Northwestern University. She directs the Midwest Uncertainty Collective. That's an interesting title, a lab devoted to improving decision-making from data. Her research looks at how to design, evaluate, coordinate, and think about visual representations of data for inference and decision-making. And then finally, we will hear from Kathleen Hall Jamieson, the Elizabeth Warr Packard Professor at the Annenberg School for Communication of the University of Pennsylvania, where she is also director of the university's Annenberg Public Policy Center. Her research is devoted to ensuring the integrity of facts in public discourse and development of the science of scientific communication to promote public understanding of complex issues. And let me say, though, I started off mentioning COVID as a particularly challenging recent situation as far as science communication. I hope we can talk about this even more broadly than that. And certainly such areas as climate change come to mind, because this PCAST is very committed to trying to address those issues as well. So without further ado, let me invite Arthur Lupia to be our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Collins and members of PCAST. Thank you for having me here today, and thank you for your service to the nation. Before I begin, I'd like to define a word, and that word is fidelity. By fidelity, I mean being faithful to the scientific method and truthfully representing a scientific corpus. The word fidelity is going to play an important role in this presentation, so let's get started. American science, leading the world in so many critical areas, creating opportunity, fueling discovery. But can we do better at using science to improve people's lives? A challenge is that many people ignore or reject scientific information that can help them. For example, Hurricane Ida was a historically powerful storm. NOAA forecasted Ida's strength and trajectory with unprecedented accuracy. Yet when the same agency sent information warning people about the storm, thousands of people ignored it. As a result, Hurricane Ida was much more deadly and damaging than it needed to be. Here's another example, the mRNA vaccine, COVID vaccines. They're an incredible scientific achievement. Compared to other recent vaccines, the mRNA vaccines are incredibly safe and effective. And NIH fueled this achievement in so many ways. And yet when the same agency sent out information telling people about the vaccine's benefits, millions of people ignored it. As a result, the pandemic has been and continues to be more deadly and damaging than it needed to be. In both cases, the underlying science was great, but communities suffered and people died because there was a problem with information. Can we do better? It's tempting to blame others for the outcomes. We know that people on social media, some members of the press, private companies seeking to hype a new product, and conspiracy theorists, among others, exaggerate, overclaim, or misrepresent scientific findings. And I don't know that we can change them, but I think we all believe that the United States government can communicate science more effectively. So I offer some things and an idea for PCAST and others to think about that can help the White House and government science agencies communicate more effectively. The idea is called Fidelity First. Fidelity First is based on the premise that we have a lot of great science, but we sometimes struggle to have important information seen as credible. The plan builds on scientific findings about how people learn, on existing efforts to promote evidence-based policy, and on the Biden administration's memorandum on restoring trust. So let's first look at some of the underlying science, and then we'll talk about the Fidelity First idea. So a few facts. Fact number one, brains are incredible. Clusters of neurons like these produce everything we believe and know and remember and feel and understand. And one of the great things they do is they allow us to make instant assessments of complex stimuli. For example, what's on the screen? The correct answer is dots. Lots and lots of dots. There's no large tree on your screen because if there was, your screen would probably break. So if you look really closely, you can see the dots. So your brain turns the dots into trees. And that's lesson number one. How brains interpret information isn't always obvious. But what does this mean for you and me and for government science? Well, one thing it means is I can't teach you anything. The only thing I can do is make variations in sound like I'm doing with my voice right now and create variations in light like I'm doing with my hands and like I'm doing when I create or move slides. Your brain turns the variations in sound and light into thoughts and memories and ideas. And in fact, almost everything that's interesting in an active learning happens between the ears and slightly above of the prospective learner. So given this and other things that we know about brains, how can we present information in ways that increase the probability of people paying attention to it? Well, it turns out this is hard to do. As studies on human attentive capacity shows, that we don't have much of it. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple of findings, and I'm happy to unpack them a little later. Very limited capacity. If you pay attention to something, it goes away almost immediately. And the other thing is there's competition. So I'm going to summarize what you're seeing on the screen. There's some citations too, but imagine for a second, and if you're a neuroscientist who studies attention, you're not included. Imagine for a moment what you think human attentive capacity is. Now, what I ask you to do is divide that quantity by a large number, and you're now closer to actual human attentive capacity. All right, so that's where we're starting. And the other thing to know is with this limited capacity, competition is fierce. There are so many things competing for our attention. So for example, if you put scientific information on the internet, it's competing with Beyonce, who's awesome. It's competing with the Super Bowl. It's competing with whatever this game is down here, words, people like it, and cat videos, which are adorable. But we were dropped in the universe where every time we put scientific information on the internet, everybody we send it to is one click away from the things you see on the screen and millions of other diversions. That's our universe. So how do we help scientific information win battles for attention? And to make a long story short, it should have 3 characteristics. 1, the information should, as much as possible, have immediate relevance to a person's core concerns. That's what wins battles for attention. So if you think about, what do you think about when you're going to sleep at night, or when you're just waking up, or when you look into the eyes of your child, and you sort of understand what's really important? Information that connects to thoughts and feelings like that are more likely to prevail over the competition. Second, consistent with values. As Dr. Collins said, we might like to believe that information is processed rationally, but in fact, the first way that we react to information is almost like a fight or flight response. Does it threaten me, in which case I often try to distance myself from it, or does it empower me, in which case I try to lean in? In fact, the modal response to information is emotional first, and only rarely do we think about it. And so that's key when we're providing scientific information. And then finally, actionable. When I can convey and I love abstractions, my background is in math, but when I can convey a math idea and tie it to action, it motivates people to think about it harder and remember more about it. So attention really matters, but attention without credibility doesn't get us very far. Justin Bieber gets a lot of attention, but he has no credibility when it comes to science. So how does the US government increase its credibility in providing scientific information? So the great thing about credibility is there's research on it. And I want to show you 3 central findings from the literature. 1, credibility is not inherent. It's not an inherent characteristic of it. You or I just don't have it. That's not how it works. A person can have 3 PhDs, 1,000 publications, and not be credible. Another person can have no PhDs and no publications and be really credible. But why is this? And the reason is that credibility is bestowed by listeners. Credibility is the outcome of an assessment by a person who's trying to figure out whether or not to pay more attention to information. So what is the assessment like? And I'm just going to focus on source credibility, what makes a person or an organization credible. We can talk about words in a second, and Dr. Jameson will talk about the power of narrative, for example. What really affects the credibility of a source is perceived common interest times perceived relative expertise. By perceived common interest, I'm thinking about the extent to which a listener believes that a speaker wants her to achieve an important goal. By perceived relative expertise, I mean the extent to which a listener believes that the speaker knows more than she does about how to achieve that goal. One without the other isn't enough. If I think we have common interests, but you don't have relative expertise, there's no reason for me to base what I do on what you say. And if I think that you don't want me to achieve my goals, then the whole question of trusting you comes into play. So a key part of this dynamic, our perceptions are the key. If I actually have expertise, but you perceive that I don't, your perception is what carries the day in whether you assess me as credible. Here's some citations, and I can pack some things later. But the question is, what do we do about it? And that's where fidelity is going to come in. Because if you present yourself, here's a challenge that we have in government. If you present yourself as having certain values or expertise, and then people see that you don't, your credibility will take a hit. So I'm going to show you one example. I'm going to offer more bipartisan examples later, but this one makes the problem easy to see. This is Sharpiegate. NOAA provided an image reflecting a science-based estimate of a storm's trajectory. Someone, and I don't know who it was, altered the image. You can see the little black line up there over in Alabama, altered the image in a way that reduced its fidelity to the science. The previous administration then presented the altered image to the public. This type of thing doesn't help your credibility. So how would we build, rebuild, or increase credibility about United States government claims about scientific research? So one place to start is the idea of evidence-based policy. Now, what's fascinating about this phrase is it's not evidence is policy or evidence equals policy. It's evidence-based policy, right? So here, evidence contributes to policy, evidence informs policy, but evidence isn't sufficient for policy. Policy also reflects people's values and preferences and moral and ethical concerns and trade-offs between different types of interests and so much more. Policy without evidence leads to inefficiencies and lost opportunities. Policy without these other factors in orange really have a hard time reflecting what people need and you know, the things that are most important to them. So we need both. How do we build credibility in an evidence-based policy context? And so here's where we can get some insight. Because in the same way that evidence and policy aren't the same, science and science-based policy recommendations are not the same. And not knowing the difference can lead to big problems for science credibility. And I'd like to point that out by just showing you a simple analogy. There's a farmer, and she wants a chicken to bring home to lay some eggs. So the farmer walks up to a stand at the market, and there's an expert working at one of these stands, and there's a big sign over the expert that says chicken. So the farmer walks up to the expert and says, "I'd like a chicken, please." And the expert fumbles around a little bit and presents a bowl of chicken soup. Now, as you know, a chicken soup has chicken in it, but it has other things in it too, like broth and carrots and stuff like that. So the farmer looks at him and you know, "What are you doing?" And the expert says, "Well, don't worry, it has chicken in it." And the farmer says, "Yes, but what I need is a chicken." And the expert says, "Well, the chicken soup is better for you. You should take it." So the farmer walks off. And the next time the farmer needs a chicken, or maybe a lot of other things, they're probably not going to go to the expert. Moreover, if the expert later says something like, "Hey, this time it's a chicken," the farmer's not going to believe them. And the problem with a lot of science communication today is that, including some that comes from government, is a lot of really well-intentioned people confuse chicken and chicken soup. Sharpie Gate is one example, but I want to give you some others now that hit a little closer to home. Okay, so here we have, you know, the chicken here is a scientific finding. It's the science. We have some other things, and it leads to a claim. So here's an example. Scientific research shows that human industrial activity is very likely the cause of increased CO2 in our environment. Increased CO2 has many effects, including changing where water is. And changing where water is can have really big influences on where people live and grow food. Some people, in advocating for energy or environmental policies, tell other people to take an action because it follows the science. And there's some science in these claims, but there's other stuff too, like ethical and moral perspectives about how to think about the future. We see a similar dynamic with vaccines, right? Some people, in advocating for vaccines, tell other people to get vaccinated because it follows the science. And there's great science underlying this advocacy. But when you tell people to take a vaccine, there's other stuff in it too, like ethical and moral differences in how individuals balance freedom and responsibility. Really important topics, but not science. In this case, there's more chicken in the soup. So when research practices are excellent, even when researchers follow all the principles articulated in the Biden memo on restoring trust, confounding chicken and chicken soup in government science communications can mislead people about the true meaning of a scientific study and cause them not to trust scientific claims in the future. How can we do better? And the idea is fidelity first. If we want American science to provide as much value to as many Americans as possible, we have to deliver information in ways that earn credibility. And so here's the basic idea. All science-related United States government communications must meet the highest possible standards of fidelity to the underlying empirical and theoretical corpus. Now, what would this look like? Because I'm thinking about it in terms of guidance that the White House or OSTP or your group might give to agencies. So here's a template. Think of a claim. For claims that are about scientific research and not about policy implications, statements should be of the form, study A produced finding B. So for example, the mRNA COVID vaccine clinical trials showed B. So that's a statement you could make. That's differentiated from a different type of statement, which is for claims that involve scientific content, but are not solely about scientific research, such as a recommendation. So in that case, a fidelity first template would give you our values are X, research shows Y, and based on X and Y, we recommend Z. So a clarifying example would be if you share a particular set of values, taking the vaccine is the most effective way to achieve your goals. Guidance like this will help public servants communicate effectively, and it'll also benefit the public too. Imagine where we'd be if more Americans were certain that the science parts of the United States government would never waver from the idea of putting fidelity first. Public commitments like these can create expectations for some Americans that don't exist today. They can increase motivation for people across the country to pay attention to and believe critical information that can save their lives. So that's a couple of ideas for you and a proposal. Thank you for your consideration.
Arthur, that was fantastic. I think you really got a lot of people already pretty interested in thinking what we might be able to do here. Let's move next to Consuelo Wilkins, please.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of our work and perspectives around how to communicate with, effectively communicate with diverse communities. And I will try to build on some of the themes that Skip brought forward, but my focus will be more along the lines of trust than fidelity. And some might say that they intersect. So I'm going to share examples from our COVID-19 health equity workstream, which was part of our COVID command center at Vanderbilt. So early in our journey, this slide is actually from April 2020, we identified several substreams of work that we thought was necessary to combat some of the health inequities we expected to see and we're already seeing early during the pandemic. So our first on the list was actually effective communications. And we were seeing early on these horrible, of course, disparities, inequities, and outcomes in COVID-19. And we're thinking not just about our patients, but also about our employees, especially those who we were calling now frontline, but are in roles that were not delivering clinical care, like food and nutrition, environmental services. You know, what kinds of information might they need about this emerging disease, and how do they protect themselves, and how might they need information differently, as well as how they might actually interpret information differently. So throughout my presentation, I hopefully will try to challenge this idea that people who are coming to different conclusions or making different decisions, that it's about being rational, because part of what they're bringing to the table is a lived experience that is different from many of us who are the scientists and the healthcare providers who are doing this work. So during our developing our COVID-19 workstream, you know, it was really important for us to try and disaggregate the data as much as possible by race, ethnicity, preferred language, and again, to the degree possible, social factors, socioeconomic factors. So here is a map of Nashville. This is outline of Nashville, and this green area here in Southeast Nashville is the zip code that had the highest number of cases in Nashville early on. And you can see here this zip code 37013, Antioch, has higher percentage of the population in this community is African American, Hispanic, or Latino. They were more likely to speak a language other than English at home, more likely to be born outside of the United States, actually more likely to be working, though earning less. So we might have draw some conclusions about the kinds of work they were doing. So the population that we're seeing who's most impacted by COVID-19 is different than the Nashville metropolitan area. So if we're going to actually get information to this population of people to protect themselves, to get tested early on, and then eventually to get vaccinated, we needed to think about how we message them differently. And this is just another graph of how we've been tracking this data all along and continue to do so. And I point this out because if we take the view that everyone is going to consume this information the same way, when their experiences within their communities are different, then we're missing a much bigger picture here. And so this is, again, data that we continue to track in our command center and disaggregate by race, ethnicity, as well as preferred language. So early on during that time, when we were seeing this huge spike in people with COVID-19, we also saw that there was a community of people who were Nepali speaking. And in that group of people, you can see here, they still have a very high percentage of within group positivity, even though it's a relatively small community of people in Nashville. So if we're trying to reach them, we need to not only have information available in languages, in the language that they speak, but also we need to understand the culture and some of the barriers to accessing care, as well as accepting and believing health information, especially when the science doesn't seem to represent them or reflect them. So some of the early strategies we used were really depending and relying on these long-standing community partnerships and long-standing community relationships that we had, including partnering with community organizations like El Mahaba and the National Health Disparities Coalition and Conexión Americas to really deliver information about COVID-19 outside of the healthcare setting. And so our approach to this was really not to say, hey, we at Vanderbilt know everything. We're just going to translate this information and distribute it. We actually went to community organizations and said, how best do you think we can help and support you? What information can we provide so that you can actually communicate it effectively to your communities? And of course, in a time where we're virtual, how do we do that best? And how do we leverage resources and access and tools that we have to support you? So we were actually relatively successful early on in delivering this content. And you can see these are actually all Facebook Live events that were archived and later be accessed, where we had people speaking other languages, the languages preferred by the community, being able to answer questions. We created frequently asked questions, brochures in response to the questions that came about. But really, we needed to leverage these community voices and community partners to deliver this information. And they were doing so at a time where many of these community organizations had lost a lot of their funding. So they had very little resources. We were trying to support them. They had lost fundraising, their traditional ways of fundraising, and they really didn't have a lot of resources to do this work. Now, I want to switch just briefly to talk about the data that we started to get about COVID-19 vaccines. So yes, a lot of excitement about the many different ways that the scientific community came together to do these clinical studies quickly. And now we have 7 different studies shown here of COVID-19 vaccines. So information is being created, science is being conducted at record speed, and now we have all of this information that needs to be shared with the community, and a lot of questions are arising. Can we trust this? Is it happening too fast? What do we believe? How are we represented? But let's just stay with the facts. Let's just presume that we can get people to believe that this is done in a rigorous, controlled way, that there are no ethical, violations. Like let's take all of that off the table and let's say, here's the information that we see in front of us: 95% efficacy in the Pfizer BioNTech and 94% in the Moderna studies. Let's everyone get in line. Well, not everyone is going to interpret that information the same way. if you are from a community, if you're from a background of people where you've been historically abused, marginalized, left out of clinical treatment, access to care, then you are not necessarily going to trust that the 5% of people who didn't, that the 95% of people who are in that were efficacious for, that you're included in that. You're more likely to believe that you're in the group that didn't have benefit, that you were harmed, or that you were left out somehow. So this is data actually from our group where we have been doing for the last couple of years, creating a new tool to measure trust in research. And it's specifically intended to assess trust in individuals who've been marginalized and minoritized or from those groups. And so we have found that while highly educated, well-resourced people, the things that might make them trust research information might have more to do with honesty, fidelity, someone's CV, how competent they believe you are. There are other issues or other areas of concern for people who are from marginalized groups. So whether or not they presume that there's a profit incentive, whether or not there's a belief about secrecy or privacy protections, these actually are more important in many ways than where a scientist went to school, where they got their degree. This is other data from that study I mentioned where we're developing this subscale, where we actually see differences in these questions, specific questions by race and ethnicity. So I'll just point out one for you here. The scale actually has two components. There's a trust scale and a distrust subscale. And for the specific question, medical research is secretly designed to give diseases to minority groups. Both Hispanic, Latinx populations and Black individuals in this study were more likely to endorse this than white study participants. So we have to recognize that when we see these kinds of studies and we as scientists are celebrating these as, we have 10% of people in Moderna and Pfizer studies were Black, that not everyone thinks that's adequate. That they may question, why is this less than the population? And more importantly, if these populations are disproportionately impacted, then why aren't we actually having them overrepresented in these clinical trials? So there's lots to unpack in how we actually effectively communicate this information. Who's sharing it? How are they sharing it? Is the information coming from trusted sources? Are we utilizing modes of communication that people actually use? Not everybody is reading the New York Times and watching CNN or consuming health information in the ways that those of us who have more resources do. And very importantly, that we not just say it's irrational or think that people are not being rational if they're questioning or not readily accepting this. We have to acknowledge these historical injustices and validate that people have very real reasons to question and want more information, and we need to be prepared to provide it to them. So I'll just end with saying that if we're going to improve scientific communication, we have to have more diversity in the teams of people who are creating the science and have the visions and the context and the lived experiences built into these dissemination plans. We need funds and ways to pay trusted messengers like community organizations. And some of this was tried with initiatives like SEAL, but we really made it very difficult to get money out into community organizations, into their hands. We have to understand that information can be interpreted differently, and we have to be prepared for that. We need to make sure that information is available in multiple modes. We need to move beyond just translating and going to transcreating. So creating information in the native language so that we're not just translating information from English to other languages. And we really need to consider making sure that people can see themselves in the way that we're presenting scientific information. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Wilkins. Now we're going to hear from Jessica Holman from Northwestern. Dr. Holman.
Great. Let me find the correct screen here. See if this works. So I assume you are now seeing my slides? Someone interrupt me?
Not yet. We're
Oh, really?
hoping.
Oh dear. I am screen sharing. Do you see my PowerPoint?
We're looking like a directory of
Jessica, we see a
files.
directory of files.
Interesting. Let me try to stop sharing. That's odd. Shut that. I'll try. Let's try that again. Yeah, I think this, well, we'll see, I guess. Let me try again. Something is going a little bit different than it
Yes,
once
now we
was.
see a slide that looks right. You can make it full screen.
Right. Do you see my notes now, or do you see the slide?
Yeah, we see the notes, so you might want to shift screens.
Yeah, that's where I'm having trouble. Yeah, if you wanted to move on to Kathleen, I could troubleshoot this. It's not letting me share the other screen.
Top third button usually does that.
Which top third button?
Go back to where you were.
Yeah, right on the top, there is where you can change the different displays.
What are you guys seeing right now?
Just you. We're not seeing your screen
Oh,
anymore.
okay. Yeah, let me share a screen and then let's try one more time. I think it's not recognizing my other display. So let me actually, the probably quicker way would be to go into this. Displays.
Jessica, PowerPoint has an option to shift the display mode from the notes mode to the display only. Third
Okay.
from the left on top there in PowerPoint itself.
Okay, let me try that.
I was asked to provide second level Microsoft support just now.
You
I'm
have
actually
the
at
entire
Microsoft
brain
doing
power
this
of PCAST
presentation
behind this
myself.
problem.
So where is this button though? Swap displays, I see. Is that any better?
We're not seeing your screen. You got to share again.
Oh,
It's not
sorry.
being shared
Okay.
yet.
Let me try this again. So sorry. Try sharing that and then swap displays is in PowerPoint, you said? After I.
Yes.
You got it.
Good. Okay, perfect. Are you seeing yourselves as well? Should I move the Zoom video?
Just the slides now.
Okay, you're
It's
fine. Okay.
perfect.
So sorry
We're
about
good.
that. It might look like I'm looking up now, but we'll just go with it.
We'll forgive you. Thank you. Please
Sorry
proceed.
again. Thank you. So I want to thank the committee for inviting me to share my perspective, and I want to thank the other speakers for making important points about attention, credibility, considering the needs of diverse audiences. These points will also apply to what I speak about. However, I'll focus now on current practices in many government organizations around presenting data-driven science that suppress uncertainty in favor of point estimates. I'm going to call this conventional certitude, and I'm going to argue that this puts public trust in science at risk. So to make conventional certitude concrete, I want to start with an ongoing debate around the US Census Bureau's decision to update how they protect the confidentiality of individuals who contribute data. In 2020, the Bureau introduced a new disclosure avoidance system based in a technique from privacy research called differential privacy. And the Bureau made this switch because advances in computer science research showed that previous methods for suppressing individually identifying information were not enough, and in particular were resulting in estimates for marginalized groups that were disproportionately affected. So when the science advanced and privacy researchers identified a stronger set of approaches that add calibrated amounts of noise to data to protect privacy more efficiently, the census decided to make the switch. What they did not expect, however, is a wave of backlash as stakeholders were faced suddenly with this idea that the census is intentionally adding noise to their data. The state of Alabama even sued the Bureau, although the suit has since been dropped. And what's ironic here is that we know from analyses that there's little evidence to suggest that the data is overall much less useful than it was before. We're not talking about any big qualitative changes between the old systems for noising and the new system. But what did change with the new system is that suddenly many had to grapple with the fact that the census is intentionally noising data. They did not realize this was going on before. And so they had to suddenly reconcile with the fact that census data is not perfectly precise. And, there is backlash that maybe seems unexpected, but at the same time, it's hard to blame many stakeholders, including members of the public, because after all, the Bureau had been engaging in practices for many years to imply that the data is precise, despite the fact that analysts at the Bureau, of course, know that these estimates are produced by a complex pipeline that is subject to many sources of uncertainty. Instead, we see, population estimates up to the very top level US population presented to the single digit. And so, the public is now forced to grapple with this. We see a lot of debate. And this, I would argue, is partially a result of what I'll call conventional certitude. We have members of the public buying into the fact that government estimates and estimates from scientific research are more precise than they are. Conventional certitude is not unique to the Census Bureau. Many estimates that feed directly into policy are presented without attempts to quantify what are often significant amounts of uncertainty. For example, the CBO's cost estimates provide information to Congress to use in making new legislation that will affect the budget. And the CBO, the BLS, the BEA are all presenting estimates of budget, unemployment figures, gross domestic product, without mention of uncertainty, or in cases like BLS, with some partial reports of uncertainty, like from sampling error, but only in liner notes that are buried sort of far away from the top level information. The CDC, as well, has been a source of estimates for COVID cases and deaths throughout the pandemic, sometimes reporting on scientists' estimates, but has been conventionally reporting point estimates for new cases, for death totals, even early on in the pandemic, when we knew that the input data was of very poor quality. We knew that there was massive selection bias in who was getting tested, for instance. So why are we as scientists and analysts so uncomfortable with presenting uncertainty information? After all, science is essentially a dance with uncertainty. Even when we're making precise estimates as scientists, we're very aware that we're trying to reduce forms of uncertainty, and many cannot be fully reduced. Conventional certitude arises from perceptions that uncertainty is too complex for the average person, that it will complicate their decisions, people won't know what to do with it. And in today's ideologically charged climate as well, I think there's a worry that, now that trust in science is politicized, we have to be even more careful about talking about the fallibility of estimates or possible uncertainty. There's a fear that uncertainty will be weaponized. However, what I want to argue today is that regardless of how strong these fears may be, it's critical to acknowledge that a person doesn't have to know what to do with the uncertainty in order for them to be helped by the provision of it in terms of trusting the agency providing data. So conveying uncertainty in any form sets up an implicit contract of trust with the agency or forecaster. Consider the simple case of weather forecasting. If a forecaster doesn't tell me that it might rain and I get wet, I might go elsewhere in the future for my forecast. But if they do tell me there's some probability of rain, I'm more likely to, one, make a better decision, one that adjust to my own utility function, but also to take accountability for my action if the forecast does not realize the way that the forecaster might have thought. And so this is true even if the forecaster and I might disagree about how I should use the uncertainty. When it's presented, there's this implicit sort of trust that I can go to that agency or that forecaster for complete information. Without forthright communication of uncertainty, people also can't diversify their actions. They won't go on to acquire more information because they won't see the need. And so my first high-level recommendation is simply that government needs to be expressing uncertainty with all point estimates that agencies are making or that are coming directly from scientific research. But part two of my message today is that in dismantling norms around conventional certitude, we should also be investing in strategic communication of uncertainty. We know from research that there are ways that are much more effective than others to communicate uncertainty to broad audiences, and so we should be making use of those. So I'll describe some specific strategies. First, we know from research in uncertainty communication, not all formats are equally effective. So text expressions, for instance, like saying an event is very likely or it's doubtful, can seem simple and therefore preferable, but they're often too ambiguous to guide decisions in many cases. So whenever possible, we should quantify uncertainty. And even better, we should visualize uncertainty information, visualize distribution in place of or along with point estimates. Why? Well, visualization is an engaging format for many. It attracts attention. It makes information more salient. And what we visualize implies what we care about. When we bury error estimates in, more comprehensive reports that have to be obtained through many more clicks on links on the website, this implies that they don't matter. And this is where trust gets lost when science ends up not being perfectly precise, as it never is. One trick promoted by cognitive psychologists that appears to improve reasoning about probability is frequency framing. Consider a classic problem like the mammography problem, where we want to identify the probability that some individual who's tested positive for some disease actually has the disease. This is analogous to the sorts of decisions people are trying to make, about COVID and test and positive rates. So the base rate must be combined with information on the true positive rate of the test or the false positive rate. And presenting this information in visuals, in particular icon arrays, has been found in medical research to improve people's ability to do things like factor in the base rate appropriately. Often we also see relative risks early on in the COVID pandemic, for instance. There were a lot of numbers flying around in terms of relative risk ratios, like if you're in a certain age group, you're 97 times more likely to die from COVID. And there was a lot of confusion about those numbers because people take a number, even if it's a relative number, and they react to how big the number seems, for instance. When we visualize information and we use a frequency format like paired icon arrays on the right here, people grasp both the absolute information, but also the relative information. When we wish to express uncertainty in continuous values, we can also use frequency formats. Error bars are probably the most common way of expressing uncertainty, but we know from research that many tend to misinterpret what they mean. We found in our own research that conveying uncertainty in frequency formats can help people reason about the fact that probability actually means multiple possible outcomes could occur at different rates. There may be cases where numerical data is supplemented with scenarios or stories in order to engage members of the public more. For example, we might want to present information about new tax laws under consideration by describing how different households will be affected by the laws. And even in these situations where we want to use non-traditional formats like stories, it's important that we still convey distribution. We can carefully signal, for instance, how representative different anecdotes that we want to convey or different stories that we want to convey are. So we can say, here's something that we see a lot, and then describe a particular family and how they'll be affected by this new tax law. And here's something that we sometimes see for a slightly rarer type of event, but one that's still got moderate probability. And finally, when there are rare cases, but we still want to get people to think about them because, for instance, they would have large implications or large stakes, we can signal that explicitly as well. Of course, in adopting greater use of visualization and frequency to convey uncertainty in data-driven science, as Consuela made clear, we have to acknowledge that one-size strategies do not fit all, and they often don't work. And many government agencies like the CDC are already providing information at different levels of resolution, from high-level figures on the websites to linked reports or slideshows available for those who want to dig deeper. But in doing this, in layering information or tailoring, it's critical to acknowledge that we have to integrate uncertainty in all of the layers here, or in the communications for all of the different stakeholder groups. Otherwise, the majority of members of the public receiving the information may go without being aware of the uncertainty. So government agencies here could take a lesson from data journalists, for instance, those who create displays for election forecasts. In 538, for instance, in 2016, was presenting their top-level election forecast in a way that led many to, they believe, simply round the information. So they gave probability information at the top level. People didn't quite know what to do with the probability, and so potentially they rounded up and they just assumed, well, Clinton will win. But notice how in 2020, 538 has drastically changed this strategy so that it's very hard to just get the point estimate and do something like roundup. Now they're using a grid of maps colored to show the probability of a Biden win. They're using terms like Biden is favored to win the election rather than giving you a specific probability. And this is designed to, and really can help someone who consults the forecast to internalize the idea that the point estimate is not the truth, that there is uncertainty there. Another place where government communication of estimates must be improved is in more forthright acknowledgement of transitory uncertainty, the fact that depending on where we are in time, we can expect to have less complete information. Unacknowledged transitory uncertainty affects a number of government agencies that make revisions to their estimates over time. For instance, the BEA is regularly revising their estimates of GDP, but they're not reporting the estimates even as intervals, even though, you know, these revisions that they periodically make can have can be large. They can, you know, occur at times when policy decisions must be made, such as early in recessions or early in a pandemic. And measuring transitory uncertainty can be straightforward for such agencies, particularly if they make certain assumptions, like the revision process is stationary in time. So it's important that we start to see revisions, and the Bank of England fan chart here is an excellent example where even the past observed data is shown with an uncertainty band to signify that we might go back and revise this when we get new data. And even when transitory uncertainty is hard to quantify exactly, such as early on in the pandemic, where scientists were arguing about what the proper set of assumptions was to estimate the amount of bias in early infection rates, we could label data with sort of a qualitative score to denote, you know, how experts feel about the quality or the completeness of that data relative to, you know, the perfect data that we might imagine. This could convey to someone enough information that they could be anticipating that they should update their beliefs as more information comes in, which is generally hard for many people to do. A powerful way to show uncertainty is also simply to be honest about how things went in the past. Many agencies, such as the Congressional Budget Office, the BEA, have all the necessary information to calculate the error rate of past forecasts. So instead of making sort of special one-time reports on this, they should be, you know, showing ideally through plots prior prediction error in their forecast whenever they're presenting a new estimate from that same forecast model. And to calculate any form of uncertainty, including transitory uncertainty, we have to acknowledge that we're making assumptions. A final threat that I see to credible reporting of uncertainty in government is that often when uncertainty is reported, it represents only a narrow form. For example, economists will talk about risk. This is quantified uncertainty from known sources of error, in contrast to ontological uncertainty, which refers to how we as scientists or as analysts, you know, might use a model with certain assumptions, but we can't quantify how good our assumptions are. This kind of uncertainty is pervasive in any sort of science data-driven estimates from science. But the problem is that sometimes even when we do visualize uncertainty, we do not explicitly note that these are incomplete or narrow definitions of uncertainty. We see a chart with tiny error estimates or even big error intervals, and we want to conclude as members of the public that this is all the uncertainty. The scientists have accounted for everything. But often, you know, the models that are being used, especially for economic and health decision-making, are very narrowly looking at certain sets of outcomes. For instance, the SEIR models that drove COVID policy ignored behavioral and economic factors to only look at health outcomes. So we need to be labeling, I would argue, the forecasts that are being made from models as hypothetical experiment results, rather than implying that we're seeing, you know, the full set of possible outcomes. Another type of sort of substitution of one type of uncertainty for all uncertainty happens when agencies don't report certain types of error. For instance, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports sampling error, but not non-response, and other non-sampling errors, which we know are big. So we need to also be, you know, forthright in presenting the other sources of uncertainty, or at least acknowledging them. So to conclude my talk, I want to end with the same story that I started with. And I want you to imagine with me that government data, and in particular census data in this case, looks like what it is, noisy estimates. So as part of this new census disclosure avoidance system, an intermediate file is created called the noisy measurements file. And this is not currently released to the public, in part because it would contradict conventional certitude. The counts don't aggregate perfectly to higher level geographies, and there's even negative counts for some geographies. But these noisy measurements avoid further errors that occur when we try to post-process data in order to make it look perfect. They're a more forthright depiction of what the census actually knows. And like some other computer scientists, I therefore believe that we should be moving towards releasing noisy measurements as, for instance, the core census products. This would be beneficial for normalizing error and the recognition of error uncertainty on the part of members of the public, and ultimately better serve stakeholders as well. So a future in which estimates are recognized by members of the public as noisy is critical, I believe, if we want people to trust government reporting on science. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Running a little behind, and I'm sure the PCAST members have things they want to speak, but we want to hear from Kathleen Hall-Jamieson as our fourth presenter. Dr. Jamieson.
Thank you, Dr. Collins. And if Gary, you can put up my slides, please. In the transition, Dr. Collins, I'd like to say in the battle between Descartes and Hume, I'm going to come down with Pascal. I think the heart has its reasons that reason does not know. And that we've got, as a result, all sorts of other factors that aren't simply reason or emotion that are at play. So some forms of things that are basically pre-cognitive kinds of processing that do affect how we do these things. And the government has some control over that as it communicates science through its federal agencies. So let me start with a backdrop. Next slide, please. We did a panel study which drew large numbers from 4 battleground states. It was part of an election study, and paneled them across time, and as a result have spring data through spring 2020 into January 2021. We were trying to ask what would predict across time the likelihood that those who initially were vaccination hesitant would ultimately vaccinate. And what we found was, next slide, that there's a high predictive power out of non-COVID specific vaccination information. Such things as, is it better to get your immunity by getting the disease or getting the vaccine? Do federally certified vaccines contain toxins such as antifreeze? Should you follow the vaccine schedule the CDC gives you or not? Basic information about vaccination was in many ways more powerful as a predictor of whether you would ultimately move from vaccination hesitance to taking the vaccine than the COVID specific factors. And of course, trust in health authorities was sitting back there as a powerful predictor as well. Here's the structural equation model. Next slide, just to show you what the diagram looks like. Next slide. So my backdrop for this presupposes that there are some kinds of foundational knowledge that we should find ways to communicate, and we should find ways to minimize public susceptibility to misinformation in relationship to them. And I'm going to make a series of recommendations designed to increase the likelihood that we get consequential background information, foundational health information in this case, but you could say it about climate, or you could say it about food safety as well. And we increase the likelihood as a result that those who want to deceive about it or who are advancing misconceptions inadvertently don't get traction with them because we somehow have done something that's increased public susceptibility. So I recommend establishing a misconception monitoring, prevalence assessment, and response system for the health agencies, and building on some existing programming, which I'll discuss in a moment. Next slide. And then secondly, we make all this monitoring, prevalence assessment, and response data available to scholars in real time so that they can help with the process. Third, we use direct contact points that we have with the public to communicate foundational knowledge and bolsters trust, and that we audit the language of all of our health agencies to flag and fix instances that increase public susceptibility to misconceptions. Next slide. So let me take the first recommendation. Here are some of the agencies that do some monitoring and recommending about health misconceptions, in this case about COVID. Next slide. I'd like to see more interrelationship among these processes. Next slide. Here are some of the things that we see from the Surgeon General. Next slide. From the Food and Drug Administration. Next slide. From the National Institutes of Health through its SEAL teams. Next slide. Through the CDC. This is the Insights program. Next slide. And the myths and facts about COVID vaccines page from the CDC. That's not an encompassing list. That's just some illustrations of all the places in which government was grappling with fundamentally a comparable kind of issue: misinformation about COVID, COVID products, COVID vaccines. Next slide. I think we should identify consequential misconceptions. Next slide. We have to find ways to assess prevalence in social media, mainstream media, and know what the public uptake is through public opinion polling. Then identify responses from everybody, the public health agencies, the fact checkers, the health community. Next slide. And then disseminate appropriate responses, that is, ways to deal with these on a cross-agency centralized website and through individual agency channels, building on some of the existing products. Next slide. That would look like this at the first element, second element, next slide, third element, next slide, and final dissemination. Next slide. This is the model that was developed by the WashU SEAL team for NIH. This is an example of what that website could look like. It could be monitoring across time with impact from the field. Those are the health folks on the ground. In this case, it might be the SEAL teams, as well as public opinion data, as well as what's available through scanning of social media, but providing a place that those who could use the material can go, meantime, a place that scholars could mine in order to keep a reciprocal process of informing through theorized research what we ought to do to maximize the quality and impact of our responses. So that's my first recommendation, a structural change in how we do this. The goal is accelerating research in that second goal, which is to increase the likelihood that we're making good use of what the scholarly community can contribute. Next slide. And as a result, this is where I put the research community across this model. That's my first recommendation. With its second part, get the scholars involved in the process. Next recommendation. We need to use direct contact with the public in order to advance foundational vaccine knowledge. And I'm just going to use vaccination now as my example. There's good information from the federal government right now that is foundational knowledge. It's underlying knowledge that fits in the back end of my model. Here's an example. Next slide. Another example on the mRNA COVID vaccine. Next slide. Next example from the CDC. This is really basic vaccination knowledge. Now, I'd like to pause for a moment to ask you to take a look at the statements on the screen. This is what scholar Valerie Reyna would call justified knowledge. This is a bottom line takeaway that digests a whole lot of other very detailed knowledge and information. This is the kind of thing, to speak to Professor Lupia's point, that increases the likelihood that you're going to hold it in memory. And importantly, her research team has found that you will share it with others. And importantly as well, that means sharing in social media. This is, in other words, a model of what we should be communicating to the public about knowledge that we want them to transmit to others, as well as to hold in place for themselves, to increase the likelihood that we get science consistent action related to vaccination. Next slide. Another example, look at how clear this is. Here's the same thing with COVID testing. Look at that beautiful graphic. They've got it organized schematically. The language is clear. You can follow it through. Bottom of the page, a link to a tool that actually lets you answer questions, guiding you to what you are going to do. Thank you, federal government. What a great job. Next slide. What I would like to see is taking this kind of basic foundational important knowledge and increase the likelihood that we put it every place we touch the public. So for example, in the 15-minute post-vaccination observation period, in the box and contents of government-provided at-home test kits, and in the digital and physical waiting rooms of healthcare providers. Next slide. Now I'm in my vaccine environment. I just got my vaccine. I'm given a piece of paper. I love vaccines, and I get information that frightens even me. It's not written in friendly language. Next slide. And it tells me everything that can go wrong. Instead, I wanted to get that piece from the CDC that told me some good things about how vaccination works and why we vaccinate and what we know about why it's safe and effective, and more safe than getting the infection. Next slide. This is the in-home test kit. Look at that tiny little print. Next slide. Now, a negative test result indicates no antigens for COVID-19 were detected. It is possible for this test to give a negative result that is incorrect, false negative. In some people with COVID-19, negative results are presumptive and may need to be confirmed with a molecular test. What does that mean? And in the backdrop of all this was a lovely piece of communication from a federal agency that could in place have been put into this environment and distributed as we were distributing Also, when we had the 15-minute wait period, information from us from the government, we had an opportunity to disseminate background knowledge. We had an opportunity to communicate justified bottom line takeaway knowledge about COVID. We largely missed those two opportunities. Next slide. We could have put this in instead. Look at that technical language now, compare it to this. Which one would you prefer to read? I can tell you which one we paid to disseminate to the public in those boxes. Next slide. Same thing with doctors' offices and digital waiting rooms. We should find a way to get background knowledge and justified specific disease knowledge out to the public every place we touch the public. Next slide. In the process, we ought to audit the language of all of the health agencies to flag and fix instances that increase public susceptibility to misconceptions. Let me speak to the certainty statements that one of the previous presenters made about worrying about not conveying uncertainty well. When the health experts told us masks work, they made a categorical statement. And when it was heard as a categorical statement, meaning people heard they work all the time for all people under all circumstances, it just took one instance in which somebody who was wearing a mask ultimately got COVID to say that statement wasn't true. What we meant to say was masks help. In fact, what we really meant to say was well-fitted, high-quality masks that are well cared for help. And then you can decide what you want to say after that about minimizing the likelihood of infection and transmission. That was a certainty problem in which categorical language was used when in fact what we should have used was more nuanced language. The same when we say that vaccines are safe. The public can hear that as safe for everyone under all circumstances. And then the first time a side effect is discovered, the question is, well, then what happened to safe? It looks as if we're not being candid. We're not actually accurately reflecting what we know. And in the process, we're increasing the likelihood that scientists and the scientific agencies are going to be attacked as being incompetent or as engaging in politically opportune discourse in order to advantage one side or the other in some political moment. Other language I'd like to see looked at carefully, the distinction between elimination and eradication when you talk about, for example, measles being eliminated is confusing. Talking about community immunity would better capture intended meaning than herd immunity. And please, if someone has the capacity to do this, look at changing the name of the vaccine adverse event reporting system. As it's currently named, it implies that the event is vaccine caused and the causal relationship has been confirmed. Instead, what we ought to do every time we talk about that data is indicate that it's a sentinel system or it's a warning system, an alert system, and we should talk about the data in it as raw and unconfirmed. Let me give you two illustrations of how there's susceptibility to misunderstanding if we don't correct the language. Next slide. This is CBS News trying to help the federal agencies. Notice its headline, measles still poses threat to US despite being eliminated. Why is CBS saying that? Because it doesn't want the public to hear that when a health agency says eliminated, it means you don't have to vaccinate your child because there's no longer a risk because it's completely gone. The backdrop is the distinction between eradicate versus eliminate. The public doesn't hear it. Next slide. And on the VAERS illustration, here is what you get when the public accepts the likelihood that what vaccine adverse event reporting system is conveying is actual confirmed events. Claims that this is the deadliest vaccine ever made. Notice the sourcing, it's to VAERS. Next slide. My alternative, next slide. So my recommendations and thank you.
Wow, thank you, Professor Jameson. Wow, well, I think we have time for some conversations and I see a couple, three, four cards up already. I think Paula Hammond, I saw yours first.
This was an excellent discussion. I really believe the certitude discussion is particularly relevant and also the one for minoritized groups. I was wondering about how we handle situations like the pandemic when the science changes, when the knowledge gives us greater insight, because I think along with the things that were mentioned, we learned that, for example, the vaccines ability to protect us is a little different from what we originally thought it would be. And I think that has changed some of the trust issues. So do we need a language around how science works and how we discover these things And if so, how do we handle that kind of discussion without, to increase trust rather than to introduce uncertainty?
Who would like to take a crack at that? Maybe Dr. Holman, since you focused on uncertainty, there's this other
Sure.
part of it that science evolves.
Yeah, I mean, I think this relates to my concerns about transitory uncertainty not really being discussed. I think in many situations, and COVID is a great example, scientists were quite aware early on that the data quality was really, really poor. And so I think whenever we are able to assess the quality of the data, something simple that's even you could make it like a color coding system where any estimates that scientists agree are based on low data quality appear sort of with a red highlight behind them. You know, as the data gets better, it changes to yellow and then it changes to green. Scientists would have to agree, of course, on where we draw the line in terms of judging data quality. But, you know, even if it's not a formal scoring system, I think this is what I did not see in, that seemed needed when I was watching people around me react to COVID, where a lot of people, I think, chose their policy or their strategy early and they did not update their beliefs. And so I think we need to really find ways to convey it, you know, directly. Things like color can work. People understand them. But yeah, that's a partial answer. There's other situations where that's potentially not going to work as well.
I see a lot of cards up, so we're going to keep going with hopefully crisp questions and crisp answers. Going to Laura Green.
Thank you very much for a very exciting session. I'm going to be studying the tape ones for a long time. I think what all of you are doing is very important to structure the data so people can understand it. But I want to add, I've been studying this kind of stuff since the 70s when physics graduate students were brought into Universalist Life Church and how people get radicalized and things like that. I think what you're doing is going to be a very important foundation, but I also think, have you thought about bringing in sociologists and psychologists? Some of this stuff we could have predicted. We knew that the bad guys were drinking blood. The bad guys were causing the pandemic, whether it was the pandemic or the 1600 plague. I wonder if there's work into getting in front of these memes and bringing in psychologists along with working with the way you're so carefully trying to get across the data in a more understandable fashion.
Who would like to go for that one?
I'll just say briefly that the work our team does is includes psychologists, and specifically the work around trust is co-led by psychologists. So I am a strong believer that we need transdisciplinary efforts and that we have people who can think beyond these disciplinary concepts to really address some of these critical problems.
Thanks, Consuelo. I'm going to go from one side to the other here, which will no doubt cause the camera person a lot of stress, but what the heck? So Eric Horvitz.
Thanks, and thanks Arthur, Consuelo, Jessica, and Kathleen for this fabulous set of complimentary talks, all very interesting. It's an important topic. I wanted to talk about Arthur's really great idea to separate some of the scientific evidence from values, and I think that works probably. It's a great strategy in general. But my sense is that it's something maybe very difficult to do that in some cases. I'll just quick two examples of people I interviewed who did not want to get the vaccine. One said the studies were far too fast. This is a very fast production process. We don't know enough, no matter what science says. The second person said, I have two parents with dementia. I worry about effects 35 years from now for me, and you can't tell me no. That's where the values that really are leaking into the evidential handling of the evidence of the science itself. So I thought Arthur might have a comment on that. We have blind spots potentially and distrust in the core science.
Yeah, Skip.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. So people, we want to believe that people process information rationally first, but we just don't. I mean, in our everyday lives. And so a lot of the tips that the other speakers have talked about in ways of presenting information can put people in a context where maybe they're ready to think about it in different ways. But in terms of the US government, and particularly the science agencies, there is this wedge, which is conveying a scientific fact, like the beautiful slides that Kathleen Jamieson showed that the CDC had. That was really factual. It never told you what to do. It told you where you were and what was going to happen if you made certain choices. And so, there are, I think, real opportunities to expand attention to that. when you cross the border to, okay, now I'm going to tell you what to do, the political process is really a powerful way to kind of sort out values. But that's, I think, where you really need to get to the reputation of science itself or government science. That's where you have to be really careful about these two things, right? Sort of acknowledging the values, acknowledging that, people may be concerned about putting foreign substance in their body, and that's a real thing. And you can provide facts about that. But at the end of the day, people may weight, personal freedom or fear of a foreign substance so much that even when you point out all the other benefits, they're like, I want to go that way. And so that's, the science can tell you the consequences of an action, but at the end of the day, decisions also depend on values.
Great. I think John, I'm sorry. Oh, Lisa's next. Sorry.
Well, thanks to all the speakers for your wonderful presentations. And I think the comment about the importance of interdisciplinary teams or transdisciplinary work was made already, but I just would love to hear from any of you your thoughts around what do you think every scientist really ought to know? What kind of competencies in this area do you think are really foundational for all of us, because our work is so designed to actually improve people's lives? And if we can't communicate what it is we're doing, or we don't know how to engage people appropriately or understand their values, to what extent is what we are doing even relevant to the people that we are trying to help? So I'd love to hear your comments around how do we actually prepare scientists who are coming along, and what do we do with all of the folks that we have right now who actually need more competencies in this area?
Any takers? Yes, Skip. Oh, sorry, Jessica.
Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not a psychologist, but I think understanding the limits of attention and working memory, which Skip talked about a little, is really crucial because we're always competing for attention. Understanding heuristics, these sort of shortcuts that people use, they have to make some decision, usually under uncertainty, and they will substitute the answer to some easier question, like, how do I feel when I look at this picture, in order to decide what action to take rather than deal with actual, the data. I think it's really crucial to understand heuristics. They're everywhere, they're pervasive, and they are the hardest thing to design for. And I would know, I've tried to design optimal visual representations thinking I finally solved it, and inevitably human heuristics for suppressing uncertainty come up.
I'm going to jump in with a question of my own that nobody has asked, and I'm really curious to know what Kathleen Hall Jamieson would say. The role of anecdotes, stories, as opposed to statistics and graphs. Can you comment upon that? Because sometimes one gets the sense that all those statistics don't have the same purchase on somebody's attention as telling a human story. But scientists sometimes run away from that because, that's an anecdote. That doesn't feel very scientific. Can you advise us?
If the story is typical, so we can honestly generalize, and we have the data to say that it's typical, then using the narrative in order to attract attention, gain identification, involve people in understanding, while also showing them that it is typical, is the most powerful means that I believe a scientist can use under most circumstances. But in the process, we ought to remember that as we are talking, we are also framing what it is they are focusing on. And so one of the things, in answer to the earlier question about someone who is hesitant because they don't know what the future will bring, what the long-term effects are, there's a framing issue that lets you ask, am I going to focus on the risk of the vaccine or the risk of the illness? And if one asks whether the frame is the comparison of the two, and then offers a narrative that says that this is the story of what it is like to have COVID, and these are the risks associated with having COVID. Now, that then sets up the individual's potential narrative of their future in the circumstance in which something terrible happens to them against the concrete of what the illness is like. And in that context, one makes the argument, getting the vaccine is a better way of protecting yourself than getting the illness, if what you're looking for is immunity and ultimate protection.
Great, thank you. Saul Perlmutter.
So first, thank you. And I'm betting that almost everybody here has been sitting here nodding and smiling at every single one of your points. from all four of you. So thank you for that. And for me in particular, I was realizing that almost actually every one of your 4 points is a specific class out of the course I've been teaching with a social psychologist, a philosopher, and a public policy professor for the past 8 years. And you've picked out exactly the topics that we've been teaching specifically. But I was realizing that, let me begin by asking what seems like a softball question, which is each of these ideas that you're recommending and the examples that you're showing came out of relatively extensive research, and it led to a strong suggestion that maybe the government could enact. I have a sense, though, that the amount of funds that go into that kind of research and tracking how it plays and doing the experiments to see how it plays is minuscule compared to the amount of money that goes into the research on social media by the companies that are trying to raise, advertising, and so that we're a little behind the ball, behind the curve. So I guess my softball question is: do you, as practitioners in these fields doing this research, have the perception that the field is undersourced and underfunded? And that sounds like a softball question, except then I'm going to follow with for the group like us for PCAST. Are there some specific directions that we could help push towards either getting funds or existing funds in different agencies allocated that would make that possible for both the experiments, for things that you've already done the research for then the new research that would take to find out how those experiments come out, and then for new research that will tell next longer term what the next problem is and what the next recommendation will be, and then finally for the education, both at the elementary, secondary, and remedial professional school levels, and that might build a public that might be in 20 years much better able to receive all these messages. So maybe first the softball question. Am I wrong in thinking that it feels like that it's behind?
I don't know how soft that softball was, but yes. So
but then the practical question, is are there specific agencies that already have some resources that could be put to bear on this that we could help, perhaps do some recommendations for, or maybe some new programs that we might be able to recommend somebody who's ready to write their proposal to the OMB for it?
Responses?
I guess anybody, it's all four of you, really.
I'll jump in and say, most of my research is funded by NIH, and the work that we're doing in trust has been incredibly hard to get funded because it's not specific to a disease or a condition or a system. And so it has been hard to, everybody's thinking, oh, trust is a problem, and lack of trustworthiness and its impact on minority health and inclusivity in clinical trials. But if we're just focusing on inequities, then we're often going back to the same institute that's has much less funding than most of the others.
Thanks.
Let me jump in. The nation needs a health knowledge surveillance system. Yeah, the nation needs a health knowledge surveillance system that could be built into one of the existing survey structures or set up separately that lets you, in the process, track whether or not forms of pernicious misinformation that undercut science consistent behaviors, whether those are gaining traction or not, so that we know when we have enough of a prevalence level that there ought to be an all hands on deck effort among those who are unsure, they have not yet been persuaded to the problematic point of view, so that unsurety can be translated into science consistent knowledge that leads to science consistent behavior.
Thank you. We are up against a tight timeline, but I hear we might be able to run just a little past 4:45 because we don't have a lot of public comments, although we do have at least one. So let's keep going. Francis, go on. Crisply.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I spent a lot of the pandemic on Spanish language radio fighting disinformation. And my question to you was, one of the principles that in political circles is employed to fight disinformation is the principle of inoculation, inoculating community with information to preempt the disinformation that will likely follow. So my question to you is, and maybe this is Dr. Wilkins or Dr. Jameson, have you looked at inoculation and the effects of inoculation in these communities and how that may be able to help us in any situations such as the pandemic and the like?
So I've not personally looked at inoculation, and I'm not aware of the specific literature there. I will say that, the strategy around the uncertainty of information and managing uncertainty, I think, is really important for all of the combating of disinformation, that we really needed to contextualize that this is a brand new condition. All of the information is emerging. It is going to change. And I think as scientists in particular, we are uncomfortable, as Dr. Holman already talked about, with communicating that uncertainty. And we also have this disbelief that people can actually understand uncertainty. But people actually can be comforted by if we're going to them and saying, this is new information, we are going to keep you abreast of the information as it evolves. And this is where you can come when you have questions. We're going to be here with you, for you, to answer these questions, and walk with you as all of this data emerges. And so I think, I think that's really important to talk about. And I'm not sure if you were also referring to, the idea that we're inoculating, injecting with the vaccination is also an area that it continues to be a challenge with communicating around, because that in itself is associated with historical abuses and distrust and health and research.
Right, not the physical act, but the inoculating with information in communities in advance of disinformation that may be disseminated. Thank you.
Let's go over
I think you're actually looking at trying to get the information in place before the exposure to deception, whereas traditionally inoculation acknowledges the potential deception and then creates a refutative structure against it. And the meta-analyses suggest that once misinformation lodges in people, it's difficult to get rid of it, although inoculation does minimize to some extent its effects. But it would be more effective to displace under those circumstances with alternative explanations, particularly when the misinformation is about a cause, a false cause. Displacing with an accurate cause is more effective than trying to inoculate in order to debunk.
Thank you. Let's go to Jennifer Richardson.
Thanks, all of you, for your presentations. I wanted to ask maybe all of you, or maybe just Skip to take this on. How do we, it seems to be a tension between the need to provide clear, concise, consistent information from the federal government and the need for, to consider the values that local communities have and or the, behavioral recommendations that make sense that are going to differ, whether in a city or in a rural place, whether you're in a minoritized community or not. So, can one or more of you, I'm going to no time, but, help me think through, or help us think through, should one come first, a clear, consistent, recommendations, and who would be considered the typical voice for that, right? Especially if it does really differ as a function of the type of community you're in.
Skip, do you want to take that? Since we're mentioned?
That's such a good question. One of the things to think about is how much time or space will you get with a community, right? I mean, because if you're going to get 30 seconds and that's all you're going to get, right, there's a way to do the messaging, where if you're going to get 20 pages, it's different. The focal point I like to put out for people is science as service, right? So if fundamentally what you're trying to do is provide a service to a person in a communicative context, how do you do that the most effectively? So I think this is the point where the fork in the road, which is, am I trying to tell you about a scientific fact independent of what you might do with it? Or am I trying to encourage a behavior or a policy? And you can make clear statements either way. And as Consuelo Wilkins was talking about, who makes that, right, really influences the credibility. What that person knows about the community they're dealing with really sort of can influence the phrasing, so that when you use the words and the analogies and metaphors, it speaks to people. But so that's critical to success. But for the United States government, I think for the science agencies, maybe the hardest part is, are we trying, at this moment, are we conveying a message about science, and then you do what you want with it? And of course we have beliefs about what people will do, but we commit to just talking about what the science said. Or are we trying to lead people to make a certain decision? And that's where I think, a lot of people have talked about this. When we're not quite straight with everybody about which of those we're doing, they notice. And then when people want to attack science as partisan, that's the example they go to. So I think, really paying attention to the audiences and sources matters, but we really, I think it's possible not to cross that line, which is why I put the template forward. But, I think that's the basic strategy.
Thank you. So I have Vicky, Terrence, Phil, and Ash, and maybe if each of you could ask a very crisp question to a specific member of our panel, so nobody has to worry about who's supposed to be addressing it. And we can make the questions and the answers really quick. We can get through all four before we open this up to our public commentary. So let's go to Vicky. Oh, okay, now we're down to 3. All right, Vicky Sato.
Thank you, Liz. Those were indeed wonderful talks. And a couple of you talked about the importance of what the audience brings to the dialogue. And so I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit more about 2 things. One is how to build back trust in the face of active misinformation. And the second is how to more progressively reestablish a value system in which science can be trusted. And I guess the anecdote that I'll bring up to Francis's point is that when Matt Damon says, I'm going to science the hell out of this problem, half of us feel energized and half of us feel terrorized. So how do we communicate more effectively, and how do we understand the receptivity of the audience and the role the audience plays? I could ask, certainly Professor Wilkins and Professor Lupia talked about the importance of what the audience brings to the table. So from quite different perspectives. So either or both, sorry.
All right, I think Dr. Wilkins and I just finger coordinated on the going first. All right, good. So what's really critical, I think, to think about is that ultimately we're talking about persuasion, right? Like, I'm not trying to sell you a car, but I'm trying to create a circumstance where you're willing to think about and understand a scientific fact and perhaps an implication of it. One of the challenges is, in the scientific establishment, we're trained to do the discovery, but not trained to think about what diverse audiences need from us. And so we tell the story that we want to tell. I had a member of Congress once look at all the stuff we were doing. It's like, you guys are incredible. You create all this great technology, but you forgot to build a shipping department, and you forgot to sort of learn about where your customers are. And so this whole notion of what you might call customer discovery, which is so inherent in everything Dr. Wilkins talked about, that is so critical. And if we're trying to think about how to increase the public value of science, the work that she talked about, like, it's not the thing you get to later. It's got to be as important as the other thing if ultimately what our goal is to take these precious moments we have and to create as much value as we can for folks. And that's the key to building back trust too. It's not so much telling people what you have for them, it's trying to figure out what they need and then finding the intersection of what the science is and what their critical needs are. And the more that we do that, we don't have to tell people to trust us. They'll see that we understand the journey that they're on. They'll see that they can rely on this. And that's where trust comes from in the long run.
Thanks. Okay, Terrence.
Hi, thank you very much for the very informative and interesting talks, especially resonates with me as a mathematician, a lot of the discussion. But my question, well, it could be to anybody. I'm going to select Kathleen. It's a little bit closer. So a lot of the proposals have focused on sort of conventional ways to push government, for governments to push out information, like on their websites, public service announcements, things like that. Would there be a place for like more unconventional ways to get messages out? So, for example, I like to say that one of the most effective ways in the last 2 decades to communicate the scientific method to the American public has been the TV show Mythbusters. It's a very, very good way to explain how we test, how we use arrive at data-driven conclusions. You could imagine, I'm not proposing it's a good idea, but you could imagine a government agency devoted to creating memes to counteract disinformation memes. Is there a space for some of these less traditional creative ways to combat misinformation?
Maybe Professor Jameson, can I ask you to go for that one?
The first thing you'd want is to have the popular culture alerted to the areas in which you'd like them to mobilize. The most effective responses to Nicki Minaj's tweet alleging that her cousin's friend had gotten swollen testicles and become impotent after vaccination did not come from Dr. Fauci, for whom I have enormous respect. It came from the late night comedians who, among other things, asked the question, if we're having swollen testicles for men who've gotten vaccinated, wouldn't we men have noticed it by now? And so the alert system that says to the whole of the community that is a front-facing website identifying consequential deceptions, if one could point the entertainment community toward it, might increase the likelihood that they would use their enormous capacities in order to create rebuttal structures. But they're within a popular culture and everybody would laugh and smile and nonetheless be persuaded.
Okay, Phil, you get the final opportunity here to pose a question to this amazing panel.
It'll be very quick. Question for Arthur, I think, but again, anybody can answer, but Arthur specifically. Sadly, you could probably find and replace scientific communication with any other type of communication in this discussion, whether it's financial advice, crime prevention, staying safe online. I mean, from any of the research, I mean, are there any bright spots in those other fields that we could learn from, or is it all dismal?
No, it's not dismal. It's amazing. I mean, we focus on where communication fails, but there are so many cases where, people are able, through metaphors, analogies, or examples, are really able to convey important scientific things. And I would argue it happens all the time. Like even in the most, we go to a math department, and even in the most kind of dense chalk talk, people, particularly younger people, I think are better at this. You're using a horse analogy or a car analogy to talk about a correspondence. And with younger people being on social media now, I see a lot of people staying true to the science, staying true to the structure of a relationship you're studying, but finding ways to convey it. So like the negative examples that we've been focusing on are really, really important. And they make the news and they worry us. But I'll tell you, there are thousands of particularly younger scholars who are interested in science communication, who are looking at the lessons that the other panelists have talked about and are doing amazing work. So there's a lot of reason for hope as well.
Well, that's a good hopeful note to end on. So I want to thank the panel for really remarkable presentations. You have given PCAST a lot to think about, and we will be thinking in terms of what our contribution might be to this. With that, let me turn this over to Frances Arnold, who is going to lead us through our final bits here on the public comments.
Thank you, Frances Collins. We have one public comment that we'll share. I hope so.
Vas-y. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, from France. I am very happy to talk about fusion with you. Now it's a great opportunity to be able to study this huge problem for the future of energy and hoping to find a solution. And fusion should be the right one. It's very important that we solve all the problems, and in France we have ITER, and ITER is a 25 billion project going on, but it's coming a bit late, and we need all types of efforts from the States and from all over the world. There is still a missing problem though, which concerns the nutrient. The neutron is a key player in fusion, and we need to know better about its mass. And it's clear that so far it has been computed only for equations, doesn't measure directly, and we should check that. So to be able to measure it, I propose to do it on the Eiffel Tower in Paris, like Galileo did 400 years ago, did it on the Pisa Tower to study gravity. And I welcome you there when we do the experiment. Thank you again, Mr. President, and let's go for a great future with fusion.
Thank you very much. That's the end of the public comments. And now we close this public session with final comments. Maria?
Yeah, I thought we had two incredibly thought-provoking and really, really informative sessions that are going to give us